Lena Hartwell had exactly three choices left in the world: marry a stranger her uncle picked, vanish into servitude, or step off a stagecoach in the middle of nowhere and trust a cowboy she'd known for 5 minutes. The desert sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil, cattle lowed in the dust, and Cornelius Pike's hand hovered near his gun. Clay Brennan sat his horse like he'd grown there, eyes steady, waiting. One choice would kill her spirit. One might kill her body. One might set her free. Follow this story to the end. Hit that like button and comment what city you're watching from so I can see how far Lena's journey travels. The stagecoach lurched to a stop so suddenly that Lena Hartwell's head snapped forward, the brim of her borrowed bonnet crumpling against the seat back. Dust billowed through the leather window flaps, coating her lips with grit and the taste of disappointment. She'd been tasting it for 3 weeks now, ever since the Philadelphia creditors had stripped her father's print shop down to bare walls and auctioned off everything that had meant anything. "What in blazes?" Cornelius Pike's voice cut through the heat like a dull saw. The escort her uncle had hired leaned out the driver's bench, his weathered face twisted in irritation beneath a hat that had seen better decades. "Move your cattle, cowboy!" Lena pressed her face to the window gap. Through the shimmering heat of the Wyoming Territory Road, she could make out perhaps 24 head of cattle scattered across the packed earth like brown boulders. They moved with the urgency of church on a weekday, tails flicking at flies, utterly unconcerned with the schedule of strangers. And in the middle of them sat a man on a horse the color of burnt copper. "Roads wide enough to go around." The cowboy's voice carried easy and unbothered, like he had all the time creation could offer. He sat relaxed in his saddle, one hand resting on his thigh, the other loose on the reins. Even from this distance, Lena could see he was young, maybe 30, with shoulders built from work instead of posturing, and a face the sun had weathered honest. "This is a public thoroughfare." Pike's hand drifted toward the rifle mounted beside his seat. "You're obstructing official business." The cowboy's horse shifted sideways, a movement so slight it might have been the animal's choice. But it put the man squarely in the center of the road, and something about the deliberate calm of it made Lena's breath catch. She'd seen that kind of quiet before. Her father had worn it the day he'd refused to print lies for the political machine back east, the day that had started the slow collapse of everything they'd built. Official business. The cowboy repeated the words like he was tasting them, finding them sour. "That what you call delivering a woman somewhere she don't want to go?" The bottom dropped out of Lena's stomach. She felt the blood drain from her face, felt the familiar cage of inevitability start to close around her ribs. How did he know? Her uncle's letters had been discreet, the arrangements handled through intermediaries. She was supposed to be invisible cargo, a problem being shipped west to be solved. Pike's face went rigid. "You got no business." "Funny thing about business." The cowboy nudged his horse forward 3 paces. The cattle parted around him like they'd rehearsed it. "I was raised to think a woman's business was her own unless she chose to share it. That still hold true back east? Or did they change that too?" Lena's hands gripped her skirt so hard the worn fabric bunched between her fingers. The dress wasn't even hers. Charity from the church women who'd clucked their tongues and whispered about poor dear Lena while sorting through donations. Everything she owned could fit in the canvas bag at her feet. 23 years reduced to borrowed clothes and broken dreams. Pike stood up on the driver's bench, and Lena saw the rifle clear its mount. "Last chance, Drifter. Move, or what?" The cowboy's voice didn't rise, but something in it changed, hardened. "You planning to shoot a man for moving his own cattle on open range? In front of a witness?" For a long moment, nobody moved. The cattle lowed and shifted. Somewhere a hawk cried, circling on thermals Lena couldn't see. The sun hammered down on all of them without mercy or preference, and Lena felt something crack inside her chest, not breaking, but opening. A fissure in the wall she'd built around the question she'd been too afraid to ask. What if she just didn't go? The thought was so radical it made her dizzy. Or maybe that was the heat, the dust, the weight of 3 weeks spent watching her life get parceled out to strangers. Her father's press, sold. Their house, claimed. The orders she'd managed, the accounts she'd kept, the customers who'd trusted her to get their wedding announcements and business cards just right. All of it gone to men who'd looked through her like she was window glass. And now Uncle Elijah waited in Meridian, a town she'd never seen, with a suitable match he'd selected. A merchant twice her age who needed a housekeeper and had agreed to overlook her unfortunate circumstances in exchange for her uncle's political support. The letters had been clear. She would be grateful, obedient, and above all, quiet. Lena had spent 3 weeks being quiet. Her hand found the door latch before her mind fully committed to the action. The metal was hot enough to sting, but she turned it anyway, pushed the door open against Pike's startled curse, and stepped down into the dust of a Wyoming road she couldn't find on any map she'd ever seen. The heat hit her like a physical wall, dry and absolute, nothing like the humid summers back in Philadelphia. It sucked the moisture from her lips and made her borrowed dress stick to her back, but the ground was solid under her button boots, and that was something. She'd been floating for weeks, untethered. Now she had earth beneath her feet, even if it was 2,000 miles from anything she knew. "Miss Hartwell, get back in the coach." Pike's voice had an edge of panic now. "Your uncle gave me specific instructions." "My uncle," Lena said, and her voice came out stronger than she'd heard it in months, "isn't here." The cowboy turned his horse to face her fully, and Lena got her first clear look at him. Weathered brown hat, checked shirt faded from countless washings, leather vest scarred from brush and wire. His face was all angles, sharp jaw, high cheekbones, eyes the color of creek water in shadow. Not handsome in the polished way of city men, but real, solid, like something carved from the landscape itself. "Ma'am." He touched the brim of his hat, and there was no mockery in the gesture. "Clay Brennan. I run cattle about 8 miles south of here, place called Broken Ridge Ranch. Lena Hartwell." She didn't curtsy, didn't simper, just stood there in the road meeting his eyes while Pike sputtered behind her. "I ran a print shop in Philadelphia until 3 weeks ago." Something flickered across Clay Brennan's face, recognition, maybe, or respect. "Ran it yourself?" "With my father. He taught me typesetting when I was 7, bookkeeping at 9, customer service at 12. The words felt dangerous, like admitting a crime. Women didn't run businesses. Women managed households, supported husbands, stayed quietly in the background. But her father had needed her, and she'd been good at it, better than good. The shop had thrived until the political machinery decided it was inconvenient. "He died 4 months ago. The creditors came the next week." "I'm sorry." Clay said it simple, the way her father used to say grace. No performance, just acknowledgement of truth. "Losing people who matter, that's the hardest work there is." Pike climbed down from the driver's bench, his face mottled with heat and frustration. "This is nonsense. Miss Hartwell, your uncle hired me to deliver you safely to Meridian, and deliver you I will. Now get back in the coach before..." "Before what?" Lena turned to face him fully, and something wild uncurled in her chest. "Before I embarrass you? Before I make you explain to my uncle that I chose something different? Before I prove that maybe, just maybe, I'm not cargo to be delivered? You're a woman alone with no prospects and no protection." Pike's hand swept toward the endless sky, the rolling grassland broken by distant buttes. "You think you can just walk off into Wyoming because some cowboy tips his hat?" "I think," Lena said, each word carefully measured, "that I've been told what I can't do every day since my father died. Can't run the shop alone. Can't manage the accounts. Can't negotiate with suppliers. Can't be trusted to make my own choices." She felt the sun on her shoulders, the space around her that went on forever. "I'm tired of can't." Clay Brennan cleared his throat. Both of them turned to look at him, and he shifted in his saddle like the attention made him uncomfortable. "Don't mean to interrupt, but I got a thought if you're willing to hear it." "This doesn't concern you," Pike snapped. "Actually," Clay's jaw tightened, "it might." He looked at Lena, and she saw something in his face that made her breath catch. Hope, maybe, or desperation wrapped in dignity. "You said you ran a print shop, kept books, managed accounts, dealt with customers and contracts every day for 16 years. Could you look at ledgers, make sense of numbers that don't add up right, write letters that sound proper for business dealings?" Lena felt her pulse quicken. "Yes, all of that." "Why?" Clay took off his hat, ran his hand through dark hair that had been flattened by sweat and leather. "Because I'm about to lose my ranch, and it's got nothing to do with the land or the cattle or the work. It's all paper, contracts and invoices and legal documents I can barely make sense of. My father ran things by handshake and reputation, but the world's changing. The cattle buyers want manifests. The bank wants statements. The lawyers want signatures on things I can't even read fast enough to understand before they're shaking my hand and walking away with my agreements. He said it matter of fact, but Lena heard the shame underneath. She'd heard it from customers back in Philadelphia. Good people who'd never had time for schooling, who'd built their lives on skill and sweat, but got tangled up when the world demanded documents instead of demonstrations. "You can't read?" Pike's voice dripped contempt. "And you're out here running cattle?" "I can read," Clay said evenly. "Just slow. Too slow to catch when someone's cheating me, which seems to happen regular. Numbers slide around on me if I'm tired. Words too sometimes. My father had the same trouble, but he had my mother to help him. She died 5 years back." He looked at Lena again, and the directness of his gaze made her skin prickle. "I can work from dawn past dark. I can gentle a horse, deliver a calf, mend fence, track strays through country that kill most men. But I can't keep my own record straight, and it's bleeding me dry." The admission hung in the superheated air between them. Lena understood the risk he'd just taken, showing weakness to strangers, revealing the crack in his armor where the world could slide a knife. She'd felt that same vulnerability every time she'd tried to speak up at creditor meetings, only to be told to let the men handle business. "What are you proposing?" she asked quietly. "A job." Clay settled his hat back on his head. "Legal employment, written contract, separate quarters, fair wage. You help me make sense of the paperwork that's drowning me, and I give you a place that's yours while you figure out what you want next. No obligations beyond the work. No expectations beyond honest effort on both sides." Pike laughed, sharp and ugly. "You expect her to believe that? Ride off alone with a stranger to some isolated ranch? We both know how that ends." Clay's face went hard as granite. "We do. It ends with her having a choice, which seems to be in short supply at the moment." He looked back to Lena. "I won't lie and say it's safe. Nothing out here is safe. Not the weather, not the isolation, not the men who think women are easy targets. But I can promise you a locked door you control, a wage you've earned, and the right to leave any time you choose. That's more than most offers I've heard today." Lena's mind raced. She could see all the ways this could go wrong: isolation, vulnerability, trusting a stranger's honor when she had no way to verify it. But she could also see the alternative with crystal clarity. The coach ride to Meridian, her uncle's satisfied smile, the merchant with his twice-widowed practicality and need for unpaid household labor. A life that would bury her inch by inch under propriety until she couldn't remember she'd ever wanted more. "How far is your ranch?" she heard herself ask. 8 miles south, up against the Medicine Bow Range. Nearest neighbor is 4 miles east. Town is 6 miles west. It's isolated, Clay admitted. But the ranch house is solid, 2 bedrooms, good well. Root cellar stocked for winter. I sleep in the barn most nights anyway. Gives the horses comfort." "The barn?" "Yes, ma'am. Prefer it, actually. Closer to the stock, and I wake better to outside sounds." He paused. "Your room would have a bolt lock. I put it in when my mother was alive, wanted her to feel safe when my father and I were out working distant pastures. Key's yours if you take the job." Lena looked at the stagecoach, then back at Clay Brennan, at Pike's furious face and the endless sky beyond. She thought about her father teaching her to set type, his big hands guiding her small ones over the letters. "The world's changing, Lena girl," he'd told her. "Someday folks will understand that capable minds aren't sorted by what body they come in. Until then, you prove it every day." She'd proven it every day for 16 years. And then men in expensive suits had walked in and dismissed everything she knew, everything she could do, because the law said women couldn't own property and grief wasn't an acceptable business credential. "What's the wage?" she asked. Clay didn't hesitate. $30 a month plus room and board. If you can fix my paperwork mess and keep me from getting cheated blind, I'll go to 40 after 3 months. Contract runs 6 months with option to renew or terminate from either side with 2 weeks' notice. It was more than fair, more than she'd dared hope. Back in Philadelphia, she'd made nothing but the satisfaction of keeping her father's dream alive. Here was real money, real work, and most dangerous of all, real choice. Miss Hartwell, please. Pike's voice had lost its sharp edge, sliding toward pleading. Be reasonable. Your uncle has your best interests. My uncle has his own interests, Lena said quietly, and I'm done pretending they're the same as mine. She walked to the stagecoach, grabbed her canvas bag, and turned back to Clay Brennan. Her heart hammered against her ribs like it was trying to escape, but her voice came out steady. I accept your offer, Mr. Brennan, on the terms you stated, with one addition. Ma'am? Everything in writing, contract, wages, terms, expectations, all of it documented and signed before I set foot on your property. For the first time, Clay Brennan smiled. It transformed his face from weathered stone to something warmer, almost boyish. Yes, ma'am, I got paper and ink at the ranch. We can write it up proper soon as we arrive. Get it witnessed in town tomorrow if you want. I do want. Lena hoisted her bag, surprised by how light it felt. Or maybe she'd just been carrying heavier things for so long that physical weight didn't register anymore. And Mr. Brennan, I work hard, I work honest, and I don't quit until the job's done right. If you're looking for someone to just shuffle papers and look busy, you've got the wrong person. Ma'am? Clay touched his hat brim again, and there was something like relief in his eyes. I'm counting on it. Pike grabbed Lena's arm, his grip tight enough to bruise. You're making a mistake. When your uncle hears about this, let go. Lena's voice came out cold and level. Now. Something in her tone made Pike's hand drop like he'd touched fire. He stepped back, face flushed, and Lena saw the exact moment he stopped seeing her as cargo and started seeing her as a problem he didn't want to solve. Fine. Pike climbed back onto the driver's bench, movements jerky with suppressed rage. But when this goes wrong, and it will, don't come crying to civilized folk for rescue. You made your choice. You live with it. He snapped the reins hard enough to make the horses jump, and the stagecoach lurched forward. The cattle parted lazily, and within a minute the coach was nothing but dust and distance, heading toward Meridian and the life Lena had just refused. She stood in the middle of the road, canvas bag at her feet, and felt the full weight of what she'd done settle over her like a coat made of consequences. No family, no connections, no safety net, just her skills, her nerve, and the word of a cowboy she'd known for 10 minutes. You can still change your mind, Clay said quietly. I can catch up to that coach easy, get you back on the road to your uncle. Can you? Lena looked up at him, shading her eyes against the brutal sun. Because I don't think I can. Change my mind, I mean. I think I'd rather take my chances with honest uncertainty than guaranteed disappointment. Clay studied her for a long moment, then nodded once. Fair enough. He shifted in his saddle, considering. You ever ridden a horse? No. Can you ride double? It's 8 miles, and walking in this heat would be dangerous. Lena looked at the copper-colored horse, then back at Clay. Every rule she'd ever learned about propriety screamed warnings. Young women didn't ride double with strange men. Young women didn't strike out alone with cowboys they'd just met. Young women didn't step off stagecoaches into uncertainty and call it freedom. But young women also didn't run print shops or manage business accounts or choose their own paths. And Lena was done with rules that served everyone's interests except her own. I can learn, she said. Clay swung down from his saddle in one smooth motion and offered his hand. His palm was calloused, scarred across the knuckles, warm from the reins. Lena took it and felt the strength there. Not aggressive, just factual. The hand of someone who'd built things, fixed things, held on when holding on was all that mattered. Put your left foot in the stirrup, grab the saddle horn, and pull yourself up. I'll steady you. He demonstrated with his own foot, and Lena tried to memorize the motion. Don't worry about being graceful, just get up there. It took 3 tries. The stirrup felt impossibly high, the horse impossibly wide, and her skirts tangled around her legs like they were actively conspiring against her. But on the 3rd attempt, she hauled herself up and over, landing on the saddle with all the elegance of a flour sack but successfully mounted nonetheless. Clay swung up behind her with the ease of long practice, settling into the saddle like it was an extension of his body. Lena felt the solid warmth of him at her back, the steady rhythm of his breathing, and had to fight the urge to tense up. She'd never been this close to a man who wasn't her father or a customer keeping a respectful counter between them. You can hold the saddle horn or rest your hands on your lap, Clay said, his voice carefully neutral. Whatever feels steadier. I'll keep us balanced. Lena gripped the saddle horn like it was the last solid thing in a tilting world. I'm ready. Yes, ma'am. Clay made a soft clicking sound, and the horse started forward at an easy walk. Let's get you home. Home. The word echoed strangely in Lena's mind as they left the road and angled south across open grassland. She'd had a home once, a narrow brick building in Philadelphia with the press on the first floor and living quarters above. She'd known every creaking floorboard, every leak in the roof when it rained, every customer's knock. That home was gone, sold off piece by piece to settle debts she hadn't incurred. Whatever waited at Broken Ridge Ranch, it wouldn't be home. Not yet. Maybe not ever. But it would be chosen, and that made it different from everything else the last 3 weeks had offered. The cattle followed at their own pace, spread out across the grassland like they were too hot to care about formation. Clay rode easy, letting the horse pick its path around sage and buffalo grass, and Lena tried to memorize the landscape. Rolling hills covered in summer gold grass, clusters of cottonwood marking water sources, the dark line of mountains rising in the west like a wall between earth and sky. Those are the Medicine Bow Range, Clay said, following her gaze. Good country up there. Water, timber, summer pasture. My father chose this land because it gave the cattle everything they needed within a day's drive. Food, water, shelter from the worst weather. It's beautiful. Lena meant it. It wasn't the tamed beauty of Philadelphia's parks or the ordered prettiness of country estates. This was wild beauty, indifferent to human comfort, magnificent in its scale, and terrifying. Yeah, Clay shifted slightly behind her, adjusting his grip on the reins. Out here, you get both at once. Can't have the beauty without the terror, can't survive the terror without finding the beauty. It's honest that way. They rode in silence for a while, and Lena felt her body start to adjust to the horse's rhythm. The sun baked the back of her neck despite her bonnet, and sweat trickled down her spine. But there was something almost meditative about the steady movement, the vast quiet broken only by the creak of leather and the soft thud of hooves on packed earth. Can I ask you something? Clay's voice was careful, respectful of boundaries. That escort, Pike, he said your uncle had you headed to Meridian. What was waiting there? Lena considered not answering, considered keeping her story private, locked away where it couldn't be used against her. But if she was going to trust this man with her safety, maybe she owed him at least the outline of her truth. A marriage, she said. My uncle arranged it without asking me. A merchant named Horace Pemberton, 53 years old, twice widowed. He needs someone to run his household and care for his 6-year-old daughter. My uncle needs his political support for some mining venture. I'm the currency that makes the transaction work. She felt Clay's body tense behind her. You ever meet this Pemberton? No, my uncle sent a photograph. Pleasant enough face, I suppose, but the letter made it clear I'd be expected to be grateful for the opportunity, given my reduced circumstances. Grateful. Clay said the word like it tasted bad. Grateful, obedient, and quiet. Those were the specific expectations outlined in the correspondence. Lena stared at the mountains ahead, their peaks still holding patches of last winter's snow. I've tried being quiet. It doesn't suit me. No, ma'am. I don't imagine it does. Clay was quiet for a moment. For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice. Maybe not the safe choice, but the right one. There's a difference. Is there? Lena turned her head slightly, trying to see his face. Because from where I'm sitting, right and safe feel like they should be the same thing. Should be, Clay agreed. But out here, safe usually means doing what you've always done, staying where you've always been, never risking anything you can't afford to lose. And right, well, right means looking at what is and deciding what should be, then having the spine to make it happen, even when everyone says you can't. That sounds like experience talking. Some. Clay nudged the horse around a rocky outcrop, and Lena caught her first glimpse of buildings in the distance. My father wanted me to sell this place after my mother died, move to town, get steady work that didn't depend on weather and cattle prices, and whether the winter kills your herd. Everyone said it was the smart choice, the safe choice. But you stayed. I stayed because this land meant something to my folks. They carved it out of nothing, built something that mattered. Selling it would have been practical, sure, but it wouldn't have been right. Not to me. He paused. Of course, now I'm about to lose it anyway because I can't keep the paperwork straight, so maybe everyone was right, and I'm just stubborn. Or maybe, Lena said slowly, you just needed help in the right place. There's no shame in being good at some things and needing help with others. My father was brilliant with type and terrible with customers. I was good with both but couldn't fix the press when it broke. We needed each other. That's not weakness, that's just being human. She felt rather than saw Clay's smile. You're going to fit in just fine here, Miss Hartwell. Lena, she said, if we're going to be working together, you might as well use my given name. Lena. Clay tested the word, gave it the same careful respect he'd given everything else. Clay. No point standing on formality when we're sharing a saddle. The ranch came into view gradually. First a windmill spinning lazy in the breeze, then a barn weathered silver gray by sun and wind, then a house that looked like it had grown out of the earth itself. Single story, low-slung roof, windows facing south to catch winter sun. Practical, sturdy, and utterly alone in an ocean of grass. It's not much, Clay said, and Lena heard the defensiveness underneath. House needs paint, barn needs patching, fences need mending. I keep meaning to get to it, but there's always something more urgent with the cattle. It's honest, Lena said, echoing his earlier words. I can work with honest. They rode into the yard and Clay swung down before reaching up to help Lena dismount. Her legs nearly buckled when her feet hit ground. 8 miles of unfamiliar riding had left her muscles trembling, but Clay's grip stayed steady until she found her balance. Easy. First ride's always hardest. He grabbed her canvas bag and nodded toward the house. Let's get you inside. Get that contract written up proper. Then I'll show you the books, and you can tell me how bad off I really am. The house was cooler inside, thick walls keeping out the worst of the day's heat. Simple furniture, clean but spare, everything practical and nothing for show. Clay led her to a scarred wooden table and pulled out a chair. I'll get the paper and ink. You want water? Got a well that runs cold even in summer. Please. Lena's throat felt like she'd swallowed the whole road. Clay returned with a tin cup beaded with condensation and a wooden box containing paper, ink, and a pen that had seen better days. He set them on the table between them like they were sacred objects. Never written a contract before, he admitted. Might need your help getting it right. Lena took a long drink of water, cold and sweet, tasting of minerals and distance, and felt something settle in her chest. This was familiar ground. Paper, ink, words that mattered. She could do this. We'll write it together, she said, pulling the paper toward her, and we'll make sure it's fair to both of us. That's how good contracts work. For the next hour, they bent over the table while the afternoon light slanted through the windows and dust motes danced in the beams. Lena wrote in her clear, practiced hand while Clay dictated terms, and together they built something neither of them had quite expected. A partnership based on mutual need and mutual respect, spelled out in ink that wouldn't fade even when memory did. When they finished, Clay read it through twice, his finger following each line, his lips moving slightly with the words. Then he signed his name with careful precision, and Lena signed hers with a flourish she hadn't used since the print shop closed. There, she said, blowing on the ink to dry it. Legal and binding. Clay looked at the contract like it was a living thing. You know what this is? A business agreement? A choice. He met her eyes, and Lena saw the same wild hope she felt reflected back at her. Maybe the first real one either of us has had in a while. Lena thought about the stagecoach, about Pike's contempt and her uncle's plans and all the people who'd told her what she couldn't do. She thought about her father's press, about the satisfaction of getting words right, about the moment she'd stepped off that coach into uncertainty and called it freedom. Then let's make it count, she said. Clay stood and offered his hand across the table, not the grip of someone sealing a deal, but the clasp of someone acknowledging an equal. Lena took it, felt the calluses and scars and strength, and knew with bone-deep certainty that she'd just stepped through a door that only opened once. Whatever came next would be earned, not given. Built, not inherited. And if she failed, well, At least she'd fail on her own terms, with her eyes open and her choice made clear. Clay released her hand and walked to a battered trunk in the corner. When he returned, he was carrying a leather ledger that looked like it had been through a war, several bundles of papers tied with string, and a wooden box that rattled ominously. "This," he said, setting the pile on the table with a thud that made the ink bottle jump, "is everything I don't understand. 6 years of receipts, contracts, invoices, and agreements I signed because men in suits told me I had to." He opened the ledger to show pages covered in cramped handwriting, crossed out numbers, and margin notes that spiraled into incomprehensibility. "My mother started this, kept it neat until she got sick. After she died, I tried to keep it up, but—" He trailed off, and Lena saw the shame again, raw and honest, the shame of being good at one thing and terrible at another in a world that demanded competence in everything. She pulled the ledger toward her and started reading. The numbers swam at first, disorganized and chaotic, but gradually patterns emerged, receipts that didn't match invoices, payments recorded but not reconciled, contracts with clauses that contradicted each other, and running through everything like a poison thread, discrepancies that all seemed to favor the same names. Blackwood Cattle Company, Blackwood Feed and Supply, Blackwood Land Services. "Who's Blackwood?" she asked quietly. Clay's jaw tightened. "Darius Blackwood. Owns about half the territory, controls most of the rest. Cattle Baron, they call him. Though Tyrant fits better. He's been buying up smaller ranches for years, forcing folks out through legal tangles or just plain intimidation. And he's been doing business with you. Yeah, seemed helpful at first, offering credit when I needed it, connecting me with buyers, handling the complicated paperwork. But the more I work with him, the deeper in debt I get. The numbers don't add up, but I can't prove anything's wrong. I just know I'm working twice as hard for half the profit I should be seeing." Lena flipped through more pages, her mind already cataloging problems and solutions. This was what she knew, the language of ledgers and receipts, the grammar of commerce. And from what she could see in 10 minutes of browsing, Clay Brennan wasn't struggling because he was incompetent. He was struggling because he was being systematically cheated by people who knew he couldn't read fast enough to catch them. "How much time do we have?" she asked. "Before what?" "Before whatever Blackwood's building toward comes due. Men like this don't just nickel and dime someone for years. They're working toward something, a foreclosure, a forced sale, some legal trap that lets them take everything clean and legal." Clay's face went pale. "There's a payment due to the bank in 6 weeks, $500. Blackwood arranged the loan last year, said I needed capital improvements to keep the ranch competitive. I signed the papers, used the money to build a new barn and upgrade the stock pens. But when I went to make the first payment, the amount was different than what we'd discussed. Higher, much higher." "Do you have the original loan documents?" "Somewhere in there," Clay gestured at the pile of papers. "But I can't remember what I agreed to versus what I thought I agreed to. And Blackwood's lawyer says everything's in order, says I just misunderstood the terms." Lena felt a familiar anger kindle in her chest, the same anger she'd felt watching creditors pick apart her father's legacy, using legal language as a weapon against people who'd built real things with real work. The law was supposed to protect everyone equally, but somehow it always seemed to protect men with expensive lawyers just a little bit better. "We're going to find those documents," she said, pulling the pile of papers toward her. "And we're going to read every word until we understand exactly what you signed, and then we're going to figure out how to fight back." Clay looked at her like she'd just offered him something precious and fragile. Hope, maybe. Or the possibility that he wasn't alone in this fight anymore. "You really think we can?" Lena thought about her father teaching her to set type, to check every letter twice, to understand that words had power when you used them right. She thought about 16 years of learning to read the spaces between what people said and what they meant, to find the truth in numbers that didn't want to line up. "I think," she said carefully, "that men like Blackwood count on people not asking questions, not checking their math, not believing they're smart enough to fight back. And I think we're about to prove them wrong." Outside, the cattle lowed as they settled into the pasture. The windmill creaked its eternal rhythm. The sun inched toward the western mountains, painting the sky in shades of copper and gold. And in a ranch house that had seen too much loss and not enough hope, Two strangers bent over a table covered in documents and began the hard work of building something neither of them had quite named yet, but both of them desperately needed. A partnership, a purpose, a choice that mattered. And maybe, just maybe, a chance at the kind of freedom that didn't come from running away, but from standing your ground and refusing to be moved. Part 2 lưu ý. Viết 6.000 đến 6.500 từ liên kết liền mạch với các phần trước trong câu chuyện, phá hồi thoại tạo thành một câu chuyện liền mạch khi ghép lại. Mỗi phần liền mạch với phần trước, không giới thiệu lại câu chuyện ở đầu phần mới. Liên kết các phần của câu chuyện một cách liền mạch. Sử dụng câu chuyện tiếp giữa các phần. Duy trì chủ đề, tránh ngắt quãng đột ngột, không sử dụng gạch đầu dòng hoặc tiêu đề phụ, phong cách kể chuyện Mỹ, Hoa Kỳ, giống văn giàu cảm xúc. Kể theo ngôi thứ 3, giữ đồ kịch tính không viết lằn màn, kết thúc phần không giới thiệu phần sau. Lưu ý trả lời trong mục tin nhắn không nhảy sang document 12 giờ 28 phút. Part 2. The sun was barely a promise on the eastern horizon when Lena woke to the sound of boots on wood and the low murmur of Clay's voice talking to the horses. She'd spent her first night at Broken Ridge in a narrow bed that smelled of lavender sachets someone, his mother, probably, had tucked into the mattress years ago. The bolt lock on her door had stayed thrown all night, untouched, but knowing it was there had let her sleep deeper than she had in weeks. She dressed quickly in the dim light, plaiting her hair with practiced fingers and splashing water from the basin onto her face. The water was cold enough to make her gasp, sharp and clarifying. Through the window, she could see Clay moving between the barn and the corral, his silhouette dark against the slowly brightening sky. He moved with the efficiency of someone who'd done the same tasks 1,000 times. No wasted motion, every gesture purposeful. By the time Lena made it to the kitchen, coffee was already brewing on the stove, thick and black, strong enough to strip paint. Clay glanced up from where he was frying eggs in a cast-iron skillet, surprise flickering across his face. "Didn't expect you up this early." "Print shop opened at 6, Lena said, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I'm used to early." She took a sip and felt her eyes water. "Though I'm not sure I'm used to coffee that could double as axle grease." The corner of Clay's mouth twitched. "Gets you moving, though. Gets you running." But she took another sip anyway, felt the heat of it burn away the last cobwebs of sleep. "I was thinking about those documents last night, the loan papers from Blackwood. Do you remember when you signed them?" "Last September. He came out here with his lawyer, said the improvements couldn't wait another season." Clay slid eggs onto 2 tin plates, added thick slices of bread that had probably been baked days ago. "Said I was losing money every day I delayed, that the bank was offering special terms for established ranchers." "What bank?" "Territorial Bank and Trust in Charity Falls. That's the town 6 miles west." Clay set a plate in front of her and dropped into the chair across the table. "Why?" "Because I want to see if the terms Blackwood presented match what the bank has on file." Lena cut into her eggs, found them cooked perfectly, edges crispy, yolks still soft. "If they don't match, that's fraud. If they do match but weren't what you discussed, that's breach of contract at minimum, possible misrepresentation." Clay stared at her. "You got all that from one night looking at ledgers?" "I got that from 16 years watching men try to confuse my father with complicated language and hidden fees. They'd bring in contracts 3 pages long for a simple printing order, bury the real costs in subsection C of paragraph 4. My father would hand them to me, and I'd translate into plain English." She met his eyes across the table. "Some people use complexity as a weapon. The defense is reading comprehension and a refusal to be intimidated." "And you're not easily intimidated." "Not anymore." Lena took another bite of eggs, chewed thoughtfully. "I used to be. When I was younger, I'd let people talk over me, assume they knew better because they were older or male or had fancy titles. But my father taught me that knowledge is knowledge regardless of who holds it, and that understanding something gives you power even when you don't have authority." Clay nodded slowly. "My mother used to say something similar. She'd tell my father that just because he couldn't read fast didn't mean he couldn't think clear. Said the world confused education with intelligence on purpose, kept people in their place by making them feel stupid for not knowing things they'd never been taught." "Your mother sounds like she was a wise woman." "She was." Clay's voice went soft. Took sick sudden. Fever that wouldn't break. By the time we got the doctor out from town, it was too late. She made me promise I'd keep the ranch, said it was worth fighting for even when the fight seemed impossible. He looked down at his plate. Some days I think I'm failing her. You're not failing. Lena's voice came out fierce enough to make Clay look up in surprise. You're being sabotaged. There's a difference. Failing is giving up. You're still here, still fighting. That matters. They ate in silence for a while, the only sounds the scrape of forks on tin and the distant lowing of cattle. Through the window, the sky was turning from gray to gold, another day burning itself into existence across the Wyoming grassland. We should ride into Charity Falls today, Lena said finally. Check those bank records, see what else we can learn about Blackwood's operations. And I need to send a telegram to my uncle. Let him know I'm alive and not coming to Meridian. Clay's eyebrows rose. You sure you want to do that? He might try to come get you. He might try. But I'm 23 years old and making my own choices. He can disapprove all he wants from a distance. Lena drained the last of her coffee, winced at the bitter dregs. Besides, it's better he hears from me than from Pike. At least I can control the narrative. Control the narrative. Clay smiled slightly. You really did run a print shop. Words matter. They shape how people understand things, how they remember them. If I let Pike tell my uncle I ran off with some cowboy, that's one story. If I tell him I accepted legal employment and chose my own path, that's another story entirely. Same facts, different framing. And which story is true? Lena stood and carried her plate to the wash basin. Both, neither. Truth is complicated, but whoever tells it first usually gets to decide which complications matter. They rode into Charity Falls 2 hours later, Lena sitting the horse with slightly more confidence than the day before, though her legs still protested every step. The town materialized out of the grassland like a mirage, a single rutted street lined with false-fronted buildings, hitching posts, and the determined optimism of frontier commerce. General store, feed supply, saloon, church with a steeple that reached toward heaven with more hope than certainty. And there, solid and imposing with its brick facade and barred windows, sat the Territorial Bank and Trust. Clay tied the horses outside while Lena smoothed her skirts and tried to look like someone who belonged in a bank, instead of someone who'd slept in a frontier ranch house and ridden 6 miles through dust. The morning heat was already building, turning the street into a shimmering corridor of glare and shadow. Inside, the bank was cool and dim, smelling of paper and furniture polish and the peculiar mustiness of money-changing hands. A clerk sat behind a tall desk, his eyes shade green and his expression professionally neutral. Help you folks? Clay removed his hat. Clay tab. Need to check on a loan. Accounts under Clay Brennan, Broken Ridge Ranch. The clerk's neutrality flickered into something that might have been sympathy or might have been pity. Mr. Brennan? Of course. Let me pull the file. He disappeared into a back room, and Clay shifted his weight uncomfortably. You all right? Lena asked quietly. Don't like banks. Never have. Always feel like they're waiting for you to fail so they can take what's yours. Sometimes they are. Lena kept her voice low. But knowledge is armor. Whatever's in that file, we'll understand it, and understanding it means we can fight it. The clerk returned with a leather folder that he opened with the reverence of a priest handling scripture. Loan originated September 15th of last year. Principal amount $500 at 8% annual interest, secured against ranch property and livestock. First payment due, he ran his finger down the page, was $62.50 due November 1st. Payment was made in full. Second payment, same amount, due February 1st. Payment made in full. Third payment due May 1st. Payment made late, with additional interest penalty. Lena felt her spine straighten. What were the original loan terms? Duration, payment schedule, all of it. The clerk looked at her with faint surprise, as if noticing her for the first time. And you are? Miss Lena Hartwell, business manager for Broken Ridge Ranch. The title rolled off her tongue with the ease of truth. I'm reviewing all accounts and need complete documentation. Something in her tone made the clerk's expression shift from dismissive to professional. He consulted the file again. Original term was 1 year with quarterly payments. Final balloon payment of remaining principal plus accrued interest due September 15th of this year. How much is the balloon payment? $312.18, assuming all quarterly payments are made on time. Clay made a strangled sound. That's not what Blackwood said. He told me I'd have the loan paid off by summer if I kept up with the quarterly payments. May I see the original loan documents? Lena extended her hand, and after a moment's hesitation, the clerk passed over the folder. She read quickly, her eyes tracking through the legal language with the fluency of long practice. The loan was structured exactly as the clerk had described, quarterly payments that barely touched the principal, all the real debt loaded into a final balloon payment that would come due in less than 3 months. It was legal, technically, but designed to trap someone who couldn't read financial documents fast enough to understand what they were signing. "This is predatory," she said flatly. The clerk's face went carefully blank. "The terms are standard for agricultural loans in the territory." Standard doesn't mean fair, and it doesn't mean the borrower understood what he was signing. Lena flipped to the signature page, studied Clay's careful handwriting. Was there a representative from this bank present when the loan was signed? I'd have to check the records." "Please do." The clerk disappeared again, and Clay leaned close to Lena. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that if Blackwood presented this as a simple loan that would be paid off by summer, and you signed based on that understanding, there's an argument for misrepresentation, but we'd need to prove what he told you versus what the documents actually say." She tapped the folder. "And we'd need a lawyer who isn't in Blackwood's pocket. Those are rare around here." "Then we'll have to be very, very careful." The clerk returned with another ledger. No bank representative was present at signing. The loan documents were delivered to Mr. Brennan by Darius Blackwood and witnessed by Blackwood's attorney, Gerald Hastings. Of course they were. Lena felt the trap closing with mechanical precision. Blackwood setting up the loan, Blackwood delivering the terms, Blackwood's lawyer witnessing the signature. Every step controlled, every opportunity for confusion maximized. "Can I get copies of these documents?" she asked. That would require authorization from Mr. Blackwood, as he brokered the loan. "Mr. Brennan is the borrower. Doesn't he have the right to copies of his own loan documents?" The clerk shifted uncomfortably. "Technically, yes, but Mr. Blackwood has an interest in the loan as broker and bank policy." "Bank policy," Lena said quietly, "doesn't override a borrower's legal right to access their own financial records. Unless you're telling me the territorial bank and trust is operating outside territorial law." The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Finally, the clerk cleared his throat. "I can have copies ready by end of business today. There will be a $5 copying fee." "That's fine." Lena pulled a coin from her pocket, part of the advance wages Clay had given her that morning, and set it on the counter with a decisive click. "We'll return at 4 o'clock. Outside, the sun hit them like a physical blow. Clay stood blinking in the sudden brightness, his face pale under his tan. "You just threatened a bank clerk." "I stated facts and asked questions. Not my fault if he found them threatening." Lena untied the horses, her hand steady despite the adrenaline singing through her veins. "Where's the telegraph office?" "Next to the general store." "Lena, we don't have time for him to warn Blackwood we're asking questions. We need those copies before anyone can interfere." She swung up onto her horse with only slightly less awkwardness than the day before. "And I need to send that telegram before my nerve fails." The telegraph office was a cramped room that smelled of metal and ozone, presided over by an elderly man whose fingers danced across the key with the unconscious grace of decades of practice. Lena wrote out her message carefully, weighing each word. Uncle Elijah, stop, accepted legal employment. Wyoming territory. Stop, chose own path. Stop, do not send escort. Stop, Lena. Short, factual, final. She paid the fee and watched the telegrapher's fingers translate her words into dots and dashes that would travel along copper wire to Philadelphia, to her uncle's study, to the life she'd refused. For a moment she felt the weight of that choice, the bridges burning, the safety nets cut. Then she thought about the bolt lock on her door at Broken Ridge, about the ledgers full of lies, about Clay's quiet respect and the space he'd given her to be capable. "Sent," the telegrapher said. Reply expected? No. Lena folded the receipt and tucked it into her pocket. No reply expected. They spent the rest of the day combing through Charity Falls, gathering information in careful increments. The general store clerk mentioned that Blackwood owned the feed supply, the lumber yard, and had interest in most of the other businesses in town. The saloon keeper said Blackwood had bought up 3 ranches in the past 2 years, always through legal foreclosure or voluntary sale. The blacksmith said folks who crossed Blackwood tended to have accidents. Nothing you could prove, but enough to make a man careful. By the time they returned to the bank at 4 o'clock, Lena had a map of Blackwood's empire sketched in her mind. Interlocking businesses, controlled supply chains, legal mechanisms that funneled money and property into his hands while keeping everything technically above board. It was elegant in its way, a machine built from contracts and coercion, grinding small operators into dust. The clerk handed over the copies without comment, his face professionally blank. Lena thanked him with equal neutrality and tucked the papers into her saddlebag like they were common receipts instead of potential ammunition. They were halfway back to the ranch when Clay finally spoke. "You're planning something." "I'm planning several things." Lena watched the sun sink toward the mountains, painting the grassland in shades of amber and shadow. "First, we're going through every piece of paper you have until I understand the full scope of Blackwood's operations. Then we're going to find the weaknesses, because there are always weaknesses when someone builds an empire on exploitation. And then we're going to decide how much fight we have in us." "We?" Lena looked at him. "I signed a contract, 6 months minimum, working to fix your paperwork mess and keep you from getting cheated. Well, Blackwood is the reason for the mess and the source of the cheating. So, yes, we. Unless you want me to stay in my lane and just reorganize your filing system." Clay was quiet for so long Lena thought she'd overstepped. Then he smiled, small and genuine, the kind of smile that transformed his whole face. "No, ma'am. I want you to do exactly what you're doing. I just wanted to make sure you knew what you were signing up for. I knew the moment I stepped off that stagecoach that nothing here would be simple." Lena settled deeper into her saddle, her body starting to learn the rhythm. Might as well make the complications count for something. They rode the rest of the way in comfortable silence, and when Broken Ridge came into view, windmill spinning, barn solid against the darkening sky, Lena felt something unfamiliar and precious bloom in her chest. Not quite belonging, not yet, but possibility. The sense that maybe, just maybe, she'd found a place where her particular skills mattered, and her particular stubbornness might actually change something. That night, while Clay tended the horses and checked the stock, Lena spread every document she'd collected across the kitchen table. Bank copies, original receipts, contracts from the wooden box, the battered ledger with its incomprehensible notations. She lit 2 oil lamps and settled in to read, her mind slipping into the familiar patterns of financial investigation, tracking numbers, matching receipts to invoices, finding the places where what was documented didn't match what was paid. The patterns emerged slowly, like a photograph developing in chemical bath. Blackwood wasn't just overcharging Clay for goods and services. He was creating a web of dependencies, offering credit that came with strings, facilitating loans that trapped borrowers, buying up debts, and calling them due at strategic moments. And running through it all was a network of interconnected businesses that made it nearly impossible to do ranch work without enriching Blackwood somehow. Lena was so deep in the numbers she didn't hear Clay come in until his shadow fell across the table. "Find something?" he asked. "Everything." Lena sat back, rubbing her eyes. "Clay, how much did you pay for feed last winter?" He thought for a moment. "About $200 over 4 months. According to these receipts, you paid $378 to Blackwood Feed and Supply." She pulled out another stack. "And these invoices for fence repair, you're being charged twice the going rate for materials, plus a delivery fee that doesn't appear on anyone else's invoices from the same supplier." "How do you know what the going rate is?" "Because I spent the afternoon comparing your receipts to what the general store clerk said materials cost when purchased directly. You're paying a 40 to 60% markup on everything that goes through Blackwood." She spread the papers wider. "And look at this. Every time you sell cattle, the buyer is connected to Blackwood. You're getting 70 cents on the dollar compared to market rate, but the contracts are written to make it look like you're getting a fair deal. Clay sank into the chair across from her, his face carved from stone. How much has he taken from me? Lena did the math quickly in her head, cross-referencing receipts and market rates. Conservatively, $1,500 to $2,000 over the past 18 months. Maybe more. These records only go back 2 years, and I suspect this has been going on longer. $2,000. Clay's voice was hollow. That's more than I make in a good year. That's enough to have paid off the loan twice over and still had money for improvements. That's enough to have bought you breathing room, financial stability, and options, which is exactly what Blackwood doesn't want you to have. Lena leaned forward. Clay, this isn't just bad business. This is systematic exploitation designed to force you into a corner where your only option is selling out to him. And I'd bet my last dollar that when you do, he'll offer you pennies on the acre because you'll be desperate. I won't sell. I know, but he doesn't know that yet, which gives us an advantage. Clay looked at her across the table, lamplight catching the angles of his face and the determined set of his jaw. What do you have in mind? First, we stop the bleeding. No more purchases through Blackwood's network unless absolutely necessary. We find alternative suppliers, even if it means riding farther or paying cash instead of credit. Lena pulled out a clean sheet of paper and started making notes. Second, we document everything, every overcharge, every discrepancy, every instance where the contracted price doesn't match the charged price. We build a case. A case for what? You said yourself most of this is technically legal. Legal doesn't mean ethical, and there are laws against fraud even in Wyoming territory. Lena met his eyes. But more importantly, we make Blackwood understand that you're not an easy target anymore, that someone is watching, checking, catching his tricks. Men like him rely on confusion and intimidation. Take those away, and they have to either fight fair or show their true colors. And if he shows his true colors, then we make sure everyone sees them. Lena's smile was sharp as broken glass. Print shops teach you a lot about the power of information, Clay. How to spread it, how to frame it, how to make sure the right people know the right things at the right time. Blackwood's built his empire in shadows. Let's drag it into sunlight. Clay was quiet for a long moment, studying her face like he was seeing her clearly for the first time. You're not just a bookkeeper. No. Lena thought about her father, about 16 years of learning that knowledge without power was nothing but frustration. But knowledge with courage could move mountains. I'm someone who's tired of watching bullies win because good people don't know how to fight back. And I'm someone who keeps her contracts. Even when they turn out to be more dangerous than expected? Especially then. Lena gathered the papers into organized stacks, her hands steady. Besides, dangerous beats boring, and it definitely beats being married off to Horace Pemberton and spending my life being grateful for the privilege. Clay laughed, a real laugh, surprised out of him. Fair point. He stood and stretched, joints popping. All right, we do this your way. Document everything, find alternatives, build a case. But Lena, if this gets too dangerous, if Blackwood comes after you because you're helping me, you get out. You take the wages I owe you, and you get somewhere safe. You planning to quit if it gets dangerous? It's my ranch, my fight. And I signed a contract. Lena stood too, matched his gaze with equal determination. 6 months minimum, remember? I don't quit halfway through just because the work gets hard. My father didn't raise a quitter. No. Clay's voice was soft but certain. I don't imagine he did. They stood in the lamplight, the table between them covered in evidence of corruption and the fragile beginning of resistance. Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of sage and distant rain. The cattle settled in for the night, and somewhere out in the darkness, Darius Blackwood sat in his empire built on other people's desperation, confident that tomorrow would be the same as yesterday. Small ranchers too confused to fight back, too isolated to organize, too afraid to resist. He was wrong. He just didn't know it yet. The confrontation came faster than Lena expected, arriving in the form of dust on the horizon 3 days after their trip to Charity Falls. She was sitting at the kitchen table working through another stack of invoices when Clay came through the door moving fast, his face tight with something between anger and warning. Riders coming. 3 of them, and unless I miss my guess, One of them's Blackwood himself. Lena's hand stilled on the paper. How long? 5 minutes, maybe less. Clay crossed to the window, his body coiled with tension. You should go to your room. Lock the door. This might get ugly. No. Lena stood and smoothed her skirts with hands that wanted to tremble but wouldn't let themselves. If this is about the bank records, they already know I'm involved. Hiding won't change that. Lena, I'm not cargo, remember? I don't get tucked away when things get complicated. She met his eyes and saw the fear there, not for himself but for her. It touched something in her chest, warm and unexpected. Besides, you need a witness. Whatever Blackwood says, whatever he threatens, you need someone who can testify to exactly what happened. Clay opened his mouth to argue, then closed it again. After a moment, he nodded once, sharp and decisive. Stay behind me. And if I tell you to run, you run. Understood? Understood. They walked out into the yard together, and Lena felt the sun hammer down on her shoulders like a physical weight. The riders materialized from their own dust cloud. 3 men on good horses, dressed too well for ranch work. The one in the center sat his mount like he owned not just the horse, but the ground it walked on, and Lena knew immediately this was Darius Blackwood. He was younger than she'd expected, maybe 45, with silver threading through dark hair and a face that would have been handsome if it wasn't so cold. Expensive suit, polished boots, hands soft from holding pens instead of rope. The kind of man who built empires from behind a desk and never got dirt under his fingernails. The 2 men flanking him were different, hard-faced and watchful, with the look of men paid to make problems disappear. One had a rifle across his saddle. The other kept his hand near his belt, where metal glinted. Blackwood dismounted with practiced ease and removed his hat, the gesture somehow mocking in its politeness. Clay Brennan, been a while since we've talked face to face. Mr. Blackwood. Clay's voice was carefully neutral. What brings you out to Broken Ridge? Concern, mostly. My banker tells me you've been asking questions about your loan, making accusations about the terms. Blackwood's smile didn't reach his eyes. Thought I should come out personal, make sure there's no misunderstanding between us. No misunderstanding? Clay stood easy but alert, the way Lena imagined he'd face a rattlesnake. Just getting clear on exactly what I signed versus what I was told I was signing. They're the same thing, son. You signed a standard agricultural loan with standard terms. If you didn't understand them, that's unfortunate, but it doesn't change the contract. Doesn't it? Lena heard herself speak before she'd decided to, her voice carrying clear across the yard. Because territorial law says contracts signed under false pretenses or material misrepresentation are voidable. And if the terms you presented verbally don't match the terms in the written contract, that's textbook misrepresentation. Blackwood's attention snapped to her like a hawk spotting prey. His eyes traveled from her face down to her worn dress and back up again, dismissive and calculating in equal measure. And you are? Lena Hartwell, business manager for Broken Ridge Ranch. Business manager. Blackwood repeated the words like they were a joke he didn't quite get. Clay, you hiring clerks now? Thought you were having money troubles. Miss Hartwell manages my accounts and keeps me from getting cheated. Clay shifted slightly, putting himself more squarely between Lena and Blackwood's men. Turns out I needed that more than I knew. Cheated? Blackwood's voice went soft and dangerous. That's a serious accusation, son. The kind of thing a man could take personal. Good. Lena stepped forward before Clay could stop her, her heart hammering but her voice steady. Because it is personal. Your feed supply has been overcharging Mr. Brennan by 40%. Your cattle buyers have been paying below market rate. Your loan was structured to trap him in debt regardless of how hard he worked. That's not business. That's systematic exploitation. The silence that followed felt like the moment before lightning strikes. Blackwood's face went very still, and one of his men shifted in his saddle with a creak of leather that sounded loud in the quiet. Bold words from someone who's been here, what, a week? Blackwood tilted his head, studying Lena like she was a specimen under glass. Tell me, Miss Hartwell, you understand what happens to people who make accusations they can't prove, in a court of law, say, where reputations and livelihoods are at stake? I understand that documentation beats reputation every time. And I have documentation. Lena felt the fear trying to creep into her voice and pushed it down ruthlessly. Every overcharge, every discrepancy, every instance where charged prices don't match contracted prices, all of it written, dated, and compared against market rates from independent sources. Blackwood's eyes narrowed. You've been busy. I work for my wages, Mr. Blackwood. Something you might not be familiar with, given how much of your profit comes from other people's labor. The man with the rifle shifted, and Clay's hand dropped to his side where Lena knew he kept a revolver tucked into his belt. The air between the two groups crystallized with the possibility of violence, hanging there like a held breath. Easy, gentlemen. Blackwood raised one hand, his smile returning but colder now. No need for anyone to do something they'd regret. Miss Hartwell, I admire your spirit, truly, but you're new to Wyoming territory, so let me educate you about how things work here. He gestured at the landscape around them. This is hard country, unforgiving. People need help to survive out here. Credit when cash is short, connections when markets shift, protection when trouble comes calling. I provide those services, and yes, I charge for them. That's not exploitation. That's commerce. Commerce requires fair exchange, Lena shot back. What you're doing is creating dependencies and then exploiting them. You offer credit with terms designed to trap people. You control supply chains so they have no alternatives. You structure loans to force foreclosure. That's not helping people survive. That's profiting from their desperation. Careful, miss. Blackwood's voice went hard. You're calling me a thief to my face on my own land. This is my land, Clay said quietly, but with enough steel beneath the words to cut. And she's calling you exactly what you are. Blackwood turned his attention back to Clay, and something shifted in his expression, calculation giving way to threat barely masked by civility. Your land, for now, but that balloon payment comes due in less than 3 months, son, and I haven't seen you stockpiling cash. When September comes and you can't pay, the bank takes this place, and I own the bank. Actually, Lena said, her mind racing through the bank documents she'd memorized. You're a shareholder in the Territorial Bank and Trust, but the controlling interest is held by a consortium in Denver, and territorial law requires foreclosure proceedings to follow specific protocols, including independent property valuation and public auction. You can't just take the ranch. Maybe not legally. Blackwood's smile was a blade. But legality is complicated out here, Miss Hartwell. Judges get busy, paperwork gets lost, valuations come in low when the right people are asking. By the time anyone sorts it out, Clay here will have moved on and I'll have legal title. That's how the world works. That's how your world works, Clay said. But I'm not moving on, and I'm not paying that balloon payment. Lena's head snapped toward him. They hadn't discussed this. She'd been planning to find ways to raise the money, to negotiate better terms, to buy time. But Clay's face was set with the kind of determination that came from a line being crossed. Blackwood laughed, genuinely amused. You're not paying? Son, that's called defaulting on a loan. That's exactly how you lose your ranch. Not if the loan itself is fraudulent. Clay's voice was calm, almost conversational. Miss Hartwell's right. You misrepresented the terms. Told me I'd have it paid off by summer with the quarterly payments, then buried a balloon payment in language I couldn't read fast enough to catch. That's fraud, Mr. Blackwood, and fraud voids contracts. You signed the papers, under false pretenses, with your lawyer as the only witness, in circumstances designed to confuse someone with reading difficulties. Clay took a step forward. We're taking this to a territorial judge, Mr. Blackwood. All of it, the loan, the overcharges, the whole corrupt system you've built. And we're going to let sunlight do what sunlight does best. Blackwood's face went dark, the polite mask finally cracking. You're making a mistake, Brennan. A big one. I've crushed better men than you for less. Maybe, but those men were alone. Clay glanced at Lena, something like pride in his eyes. I'm not. The man with the rifle started to raise it, and everything happened very fast. Clay's hand went to his revolver. Lena dove sideways behind the water trough, and Blackwood barked, "Stop!" loud enough to freeze everyone in place. Not here, Blackwood said to his men, never taking his eyes off Clay. Not like this. He turned his horse with a sharp jerk of the reins. You want to fight, Brennan? You'll get one. Legal, public, and thorough. I'll tear apart every aspect of your finances until everyone in the territory knows you're a failure who couldn't keep his own ranch running. And Miss Hartwell?" He looked at Lena, still crouched behind the trough. "I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of woman takes up with a rancher she just met, living alone out here without even the pretense of propriety." "Let them talk," Lena said, standing up slowly. "I've survived worse than gossip." "Have you?" Blackwood's smile returned, vicious now. "We'll see." He rode out at a gallop, his men flanking him, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of hoofbeats fading into distance. Lena stood in the yard, her legs shaking from adrenaline, and realized she'd just declared war on the most powerful man in the territory. Clay holstered his revolver and crossed to her. "You all right?" "No." Lena's laugh came out shaky. "I'm terrified. I just called a man a thief to his face while he had armed riders backing him up. That was possibly the stupidest thing I've ever done. Or the bravest." Clay's hand found her shoulder, steady and warm. "Lena, you didn't have to do that. This is my fight. It's our fight now." Lena looked at the dust settling where Blackwood had disappeared. "He's going to come after both of us, and he's not going to fight fair. We need help, Clay. We need allies, evidence, and a legal strategy that doesn't depend on hoping for justice." "I know." Clay's jaw was tight. "And I think I know where to start." 2 days later, Lena found herself riding beside Clay toward a ranch that made Broken Ridge look prosperous by comparison. The buildings were weathered to the point of collapse, fences held together with wire and prayer, and the few cattle she could see were scraggly things that looked like hard winter would kill them. "This is the Morrison place," Clay said. "Jack Morrison lost his wife last year, been struggling ever since. He's got 2 kids, no help, and debts to Blackwood that are bleeding him dry. Why are we here?" "Because if Blackwood's doing to me what you found in those ledgers, he's doing it to Jack too, and to every other small rancher in the territory." Clay dismounted and helped Lena down. "We can't fight him alone. But together, with proof and witnesses." He trailed off as a man emerged from the house, 40-something, gaunt, with eyes that had seen too much loss and not enough hope. Jack Morrison looked at them with the wariness of someone who'd learned to expect bad news. "Clay Brennan, what brings you out here?" "Need to talk to you about Blackwood, about what he's been doing to your finances." Clay gestured to Lena. "This is Lena Hartwell. She's been going through my books, found some things you ought to know about." Morrison's eyes narrowed. "What kind of things?" "The kind where you're paying 40% more for feed than you should be," Lena said quietly. "The kind where your cattle are being bought at 70 cents on the dollar. The kind where every business dealing you have runs through Blackwood somehow, and every one of them costs you more than it should." Morrison's face went carefully blank. "You come out here to tell me I'm being cheated? Hell, I already know that. Everyone knows it. It's just how things are." "It doesn't have to be." Lena pulled out the papers she'd brought, copied receipts, comparative pricing, documentation of every overcharge she'd found. "Mr. Morrison, what if I told you that you could prove it, document it, take it to a judge and fight back?" "I'd say you're either naive or crazy." But Morrison took the papers, started reading. His expression shifted as he worked through the numbers, disbelief giving way to anger, anger hardening into something colder. "This is from your ranch?" "Every page, and I'd bet money your records would show the same patterns." Lena watched him carefully. "Clay and I are building a case against Blackwood, but one ranch isn't enough. We need other people willing to share their records, willing to stand up and say this isn't right." "Stand up!" Morrison's laugh was bitter. "Miss, I got 2 kids depending on me and a note to Blackwood that comes due in 6 weeks. Standing up gets me foreclosed and my children homeless." "Maybe." Clay stepped forward. "Or maybe it gets you free. Jack, what's your balloon payment? $400? Mine's $300. You think Blackwood's going to let either of us keep our land when those come due?" Clay's voice was gentle but relentless. "He's going to take everything whether we fight or not. At least this way we go down swinging." Morrison looked between them, the papers crumpling slightly in his grip. "You're really doing this? Taking on Blackwood?" "We are." Lena met his eyes. "But we need help. We need witnesses, records, people willing to say publicly that they've been systematically exploited. The more voices we have, the harder we are to silence. And if we lose, then we lose everything, Clay said simply. But we're going to lose it anyway. Blackwood's not going to stop. He'll keep squeezing until there's nothing left, then take the land and move on to the next victim, unless someone stops him. Morrison was quiet for a long time, staring at the papers in his hands. Lena could see the war happening behind his eyes, fear versus anger, survival versus dignity. Finally, he looked up. I got records going back 3 years. If you want to look through them, find what you need, I won't stop you. He paused. But I can't promise I'll testify. Not until I know my kids are protected. That's fair, Lena said. Can I see the records now? What she found in Morrison's ledgers made her documentation of Clay's exploitation look almost gentle. Blackwood had his hooks in deeper here. More debt, worse terms, charges that made no sense even trying to justify them as market rates. Morrison was being bled so thoroughly that Lena wondered how he was still standing. He's been doing this for years, she said, her voice shaking with fury as she worked through the 3rd year of records. Since your wife got sick, maybe before. Every time you needed help, he offered it, with strings that tightened every time you pulled. Morrison stood at the window, looking out at his failing ranch. Margaret handled the books when she was alive. She tried to tell me something was wrong, but I didn't listen. Thought she was just worried because she was sick. His voice cracked. By the time I understood what she was trying to say, it was too late. She died, and I was so deep in debt I couldn't see daylight. Mr. Morrison, Lena stood and crossed to him. Your wife was right, and she'd want you to fight this. Not for revenge, but because it's wrong. Because other families are going through what you went through, and someone has to stop it. Easy for you to say, you're not the one who'll watch his kids go hungry if this fails. No. I'm the one who lost her father and her home and everything she built because men like Blackwood decided the rules didn't apply to them. Lena's hands curled into fists. I couldn't fight back then. I didn't have the knowledge or the resources or the support, but I have them now, and I'm not going to waste them. Morrison turned to look at her, really look at her, and something in his face shifted. You mean that? Every word. He nodded slowly. Take what you need from the records, copy whatever helps, and if you can get 2 or 3 other ranchers to commit to testifying, I'll think about it. But I need to know I'm not alone before I risk my children's future. You won't be alone, Clay promised. We'll make sure of it. They left with Morrison's ledgers copied and a list of 3 other ranchers who might be facing similar exploitation. The sun was setting as they rode back toward Broken Ridge, painting the sky in shades of fire and ash, and Lena felt the weight of what they'd started settling onto her shoulders like a physical burden. He's scared, she said quietly. He should be. We all should be. Clay's face was grim in the fading light. Blackwood's not going to let this go, Lena. The more people we talk to, the more dangerous this gets. I know. And you still want to keep going? Lena thought about Morrison's children, about the fear in their father's eyes, about all the families trapped in Blackwood's web because they didn't know how to fight back or were too afraid to try. She thought about her father's print shop, about the creditors who'd smiled while they stole everything, about the merchant in Meridian who thought he could buy her like merchandise. I want to keep going, she said. But Clay, we need more than documentation. We need leverage. Something that makes Blackwood vulnerable the way he's made everyone else vulnerable. What kind of leverage? I don't know yet, but men who build empires on exploitation always have secrets. Things they don't want exposed, people they've hurt badly enough that they'd testify if they thought they'd be protected. Lena stared at the horizon where darkness was swallowing the last of the light. We need to find those secrets before Blackwood finds a way to destroy us. How? By doing what I do best. Lena's smile was sharp as a knife's edge, reading the fine print and asking the questions no one else wants answered. They rode into the ranch yard as full dark settled over the land, and Lena felt the familiar anxiety of nightfall in an isolated place prickle across her skin. But she also felt something else, purpose burning bright and fierce, the kind of purpose that came from choosing to fight instead of flee, from standing ground instead of giving it up. Inside, she lit the lamps and spread the copied Morrison records across the table beside Clay's documents. 2 ranches, two sets of exploitation, the same patterns running through both like poison in water. She started making notes, cross-referencing charges and dates, building a timeline of how Blackwood had systematically destroyed two families' financial security while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business. Clay made coffee and watched her work, and when he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but certain. "Thank you." Lena looked up. "For what?" "For seeing this. For caring about it. For being willing to fight when you could have just kept your head down and collected your wages." He paused. "For not being alone in this anymore." "You're welcome." Lena returned to her notes, but something warm had kindled in her chest. Not romance, not yet, but recognition. The sense of being seen clearly and valued honestly, of having someone trust her competence and respect her choices. "Now let's make sure your gratitude doesn't get us both killed." "Yes, ma'am." Clay's smile was tired but genuine. "I'll do my best." Outside, the wind picked up, carrying the smell of coming weather. Somewhere in the darkness, Darius Blackwood sat in his comfortable house making plans to crush the resistance before it could spread. And in a ranch house lit by oil lamps, two people who'd started as strangers bent over documents and built the beginning of something Blackwood hadn't counted on. Not just resistance, alliance. The kind that came from shared purpose and mutual respect, from choosing to stand together when standing alone meant certain defeat. The kind that might actually have a chance of winning. The attack came from a direction Lena hadn't anticipated. Her uncle arrived at Broken Ridge 6 days after her telegram, stepping down from a hired coach with the righteous fury of a man whose authority had been publicly challenged. Lena saw the dust cloud first and knew immediately, with sinking certainty, that this wasn't Blackwood returning for another confrontation. "Clay." She set down the ledger she'd been working through and stood slowly. "That's my uncle." Clay moved to the window, his hand dropping instinctively toward his revolver before he stopped himself. "You want me to send him away?" "No, I need to face this." Lena smoothed her skirts and squared her shoulders, feeling her spine straighten with the old defensive posture she'd worn through weeks of creditor meetings and pitying church ladies. "But stay close. He can be persuasive when he wants something." Reverend Elijah Crow was a tall man who wore his faith like armor and his disapproval like a weapon. He'd aged since Lena had last seen him at her father's funeral, more gray in his beard, deeper lines around his mouth. But his eyes held the same uncompromising certainty that had made her father choose distance over reconciliation years ago. He stood in the ranch yard looking at the house and barn and scattered cattle with the expression of a man surveying evidence of moral failure. "Lena Margaret Hartwell." His voice carried the cadence of Sunday sermons. "I have traveled 2,000 miles to retrieve you from this situation. Collect your belongings. We leave within the hour." "No." The word came out steady, and Lena felt something shift inside her. The final severing of the girl who'd tried to please everyone and the birth of the woman who'd stopped caring about approval. "I'm staying." Elijah's face darkened. "This is not a discussion. You are unmarried, unchaperoned, living in isolation with a man you barely know. The scandal alone? The scandal is that you tried to sell me to a stranger without asking if I wanted to be sold." Lena walked out into the yard, and Clay followed at a respectful distance. "I have legal employment here, Uncle. A written contract, fair wages, and separate quarters. There's nothing improper about it." "Improper?" Elijah's laugh was sharp and humorless. "You've thrown away a respectable match with a God-fearing merchant for manual labor on a failing ranch. You're living like a servant, Lena, when you could have been mistress of a proper household." "I was running a print shop when I was 16, Lena shot back. "I kept books, managed employees, negotiated with suppliers. The only difference between that and what I'm doing now is that this time I'm getting paid for it instead of being told I should be grateful for the opportunity to work for free. Your father indulged you terribly. It's made you unmarriageable." Elijah turned his attention to Clay, and his expression curdled into something uglier. "And you, sir, are taking advantage of a vulnerable young woman for your own purposes. Whatever you've promised her, whatever pretty lies you've told, I've told her the truth." Clay's voice was quiet, but had enough steel beneath it to cut. "That I needed help with paperwork I couldn't manage alone, and she had skills I didn't. That I'd pay her fair wages for honest work and give her the respect she's earned. If that's taking advantage, then I'm guilty as charged. Respect. Elijah's lip curled. Is that what you call it when you lure a gentlewoman into living alone with you miles from civilization? When you expose her to gossip and ruin that will follow her the rest of her life? I call it giving her a choice. Clay met Elijah's glare without flinching. Something it seemed she wasn't getting much of back east. The silence stretched thin and dangerous. Lena could see the rage building in her uncle's face, the particular fury of a man whose authority had been questioned in front of witnesses. She'd seen that look before. In creditors who didn't like being challenged, in church elders who thought women should stay silent, in every man who'd ever been surprised that she could add faster than they could. Lena. Elijah turned back to her, and his voice shifted into the gentle reasonableness that was somehow more threatening than his anger. I understand you're upset about your father's death, about losing the shop. Grief makes people do irrational things, but you need to think about your future. Mr. Pemberton has been very patient, but even his patience has limits. If you return with me now, apologize for this episode, the engagement can proceed as planned. I don't want the engagement. Lena kept her voice level. I never did. You arranged it without consulting me, presented it as inevitable, and expected me to be grateful. Well, I'm not grateful, and I'm not coming back. You have no other options. Elijah stepped closer, and Lena held her ground. No family willing to take you in, no prospects, no resources. How long do you think you'll last out here? How long before this man tires of you or finds a younger woman or simply decides your services aren't worth the trouble? 6 months minimum, per the contract, Clay said evenly. After that, Miss Hartwell can choose to renew or seek employment elsewhere. But that's her choice, not yours or mine or anyone else's. A contract. Elijah's eyes narrowed. Let me see it. No. Lena crossed her arms. It's a private business agreement. You have no standing to review it. I'm your guardian. I'm 23 years old. Under territorial law, I'm of legal age to contract on my own behalf. Lena had looked this up 2 days ago, preparing for exactly this conversation. You have no legal authority over me, Uncle. You never did. You just counted on me being too scared or too polite to tell you no. Something dangerous flickered across Elijah's face. Is that what this is about? Rebellion? Some childish need to defy authority because you're angry about circumstances beyond anyone's control? This is about choosing my own path instead of walking one you selected without asking if it's where I wanted to go. Lena felt the words pouring out, months of suppressed frustration finally finding voice. You didn't ask if I wanted to marry Mr. Pemberton. You didn't ask if I wanted to leave Philadelphia. You didn't ask if I had other plans or dreams or any thoughts at all about my own future. You just decided what was convenient for you and assumed I'd comply. I decided what was best for you. You decided what was easiest for you. Lena's voice cracked but didn't break. A woman alone is a problem, and marrying me off to your political ally solved that problem. Never mind what I wanted. Never mind what I was capable of. Just get rid of the inconvenient niece before she becomes an embarrassment. How dare you? How dare I what? Tell the truth? Lena laughed, and it came out bitter. You know what's funny, Uncle? I spent 3 weeks thinking I was worthless because everyone kept telling me I was. The creditors, the church ladies, you and your letters. All of you so certain that a woman who'd run a business for 16 years couldn't possibly have any skills worth paying for. And then I met someone who actually needed what I could do, who valued competence over propriety, and suddenly I'm dangerous enough that you came all this way to drag me back into line. Elijah's face went red. I came to save you from ruin. I'm not ruined. I'm employed. There's a difference. Lena met his eyes and refused to look away. Go back to Philadelphia, Uncle. Tell Mr. Pemberton the engagement is off. Tell your political friends whatever you need to tell them. But leave me out of it. I'm done being currency in other people's transactions. You're making a mistake that will haunt you the rest of your life. Maybe, but it's my mistake to make. Elijah stood there for a long moment, and Lena could see him calculating, weighing the cost of forcing the issue against the embarrassment of public failure, measuring her defiance against his need for control. Finally, he turned toward the coach, his movements stiff with suppressed rage. When this falls apart, he said without looking back, Don't come crying to me for rescue. You've made your choice. Live with it." The coach pulled away, leaving nothing but dust and the echo of hoofbeats, and Lena stood in the yard feeling like she'd just survived a storm. Her hands were shaking, her heart racing, but underneath the fear was something solid and unshakable, the bone-deep certainty that she'd done the right thing even if it was the hard thing. "You all right?" Clay's voice was gentle. "No." Lena turned to face him, and to her horror felt tears prickling behind her eyes. "But I will be." "He was wrong, you know, about all of it." Clay kept his distance, giving her space to fall apart if she needed to. "You're not a burden or a problem or something that needs fixing. You're the reason I might actually save this ranch. Or lose it spectacularly while trying to fight Blackwood." Lena wiped at her eyes impatiently. "Clay, my uncle showing up here, making accusations about impropriety, that's exactly the kind of ammunition Blackwood will use against us. He'll spread rumors, question my character, make people doubt anything I say about his business practices." "Let him try." Clay's jaw tightened. "Anyone who's talked to you for 5 minutes knows you're smarter than half the men in this territory combined. Blackwood can spread all the rumors he wants, won't change the numbers in those ledgers. Numbers don't matter if no one trusts the person presenting them." Lena walked toward the house, suddenly exhausted. "We need to move faster, Clay. Document everything, build the case, find the leverage before Blackwood has time to destroy my credibility completely." What she found 2 days later, buried in a stack of old contracts Clay had kept in a trunk, made her forget about her uncle's visit entirely. It was a land deed, not for Broken Ridge, but for a parcel of territory 20 miles south, signed over to Blackwood 5 years earlier by a rancher named Thomas Garrett. The transfer was marked as a voluntary sale, but the price listed was so far below market value that Lena's instincts immediately screamed fraud. "Who was Thomas Garrett?" she asked Clay. "Neighbor of my father's. Good man, hard worker. His ranch bordered Blackwood's southern holdings." Clay frowned. "He died about 4 years ago. Kicked by a horse, they said. His widow sold off the cattle and moved to Denver." "Did she sell the land too?" "I assume so. The ranch was abandoned when I rode past it last year." Lena pulled out the territorial land registry she'd borrowed from the Charity Falls courthouse, a massive ledger that tracked every property transfer in the region. She found the Garrett property and traced its history forward from the date of the deed. The transfer to Blackwood was listed as voluntary sale for $700. 6 months later, Blackwood had sold half the property to the railroad for $4,000, keeping the rest for grazing rights. "He cheated Garrett," Lena breathed. "Bought the land for a fraction of its value, probably knowing the railroad was coming through and would need the right-of-way." "That's not illegal if Garrett agreed to sell. But what if he didn't? What if this was fraud or coercion or—" Lena's mind raced through possibilities. "Clay, do you know how to reach Mrs. Garrett? Is she still in Denver?" "I can ask around." "Why?" "Because if Blackwood defrauded her husband or forced that sale through intimidation, she might be willing to testify. And if he did it to Garrett, he's probably done it to others." Lena started pulling more deeds from the trunk, laying them out across the table. "How many of these do you have?" "Couple dozen, maybe? My father used to witness land transfers for neighbors, keep copies for their records." Lena spent the next 6 hours going through every deed, cross-referencing against the land registry, building a timeline of property transfers that all seemed to flow toward Blackwood like water running downhill. Some were clearly legitimate sales at fair prices, but others, nearly a third, showed the same pattern. Property sold to Blackwood at below-market rates, often by ranchers who'd had recent financial troubles or family tragedies. And in almost every case, Blackwood had resold or leveraged the land within a year for substantial profit. "This is it," she said finally, her voice shaking with exhaustion and excitement. "This is the leverage we need. Clay, Blackwood hasn't just been exploiting people through bad business practices. He's been systematically acquiring land through predatory purchases, using people's desperation against them. If we can prove a pattern, if we can find even 1 or 2 sellers who will testify they were coerced or defrauded, we can show he's not just a hard businessman, he's a criminal." Clay looked at the papers spread across his kitchen table like they were weapons. "But getting people to testify against him means asking them to risk everything. These are folks who've already lost their land. What do they have left to lose?" "Their silence." Lena met his eyes. Blackwood's power comes from people being too afraid or too ashamed to speak up. But if we can get even 2 or 3 to go on record, others might follow. There's courage in numbers, Clay. And right now we need to build an army. The trip to Denver took 3 days by stage, and Lena made it alone over Clay's strenuous objections. They needed someone to stay and mind the ranch, and more importantly, Lena knew that Mrs. Garrett would be more likely to talk to a woman about what had happened to her husband than to a cowboy she barely knew. Clay had given her money for the journey and a letter of introduction, and as the stagecoach rattled east across the Wyoming plain, Lena reviewed everything she knew about the Garrett case and prepared her approach. Denver was a shock after weeks of frontier isolation, noise and crowds and buildings that climbed 3 stories into the sky. Lena found Mrs. Garrett's address through the city directory and stood outside a modest boarding house gathering her courage. Everything depended on this conversation. If Mrs. Garrett wouldn't talk, if she was too afraid or too loyal to her husband's memory to admit he might have been cheated, then Lena had wasted 3 days and precious resources on a dead end. She knocked. The woman who answered was younger than Lena expected, maybe 40, with graying hair and eyes that had forgotten how to hope. She looked at Lena with the wariness of someone who'd learned that strangers usually brought bad news. Mrs. Garrett, my name is Lena Hartwell. I work for Clay Brennan at Broken Ridge Ranch. I'd like to talk to you about your husband's property sale to Darius Blackwood, if you have a few minutes. Mrs. Garrett's face went pale. I don't want any trouble. Neither do I, but I think your husband was cheated, and I think Blackwood has been cheating a lot of people the same way. I'm trying to build a case against him, and I need your help. You can't fight Blackwood. Nobody can. But Mrs. Garrett stepped back and opened the door wider. Come in. But I'm not promising anything. The room was small and tidy, furnished with the kind of carefully maintained pieces that spoke of genteel poverty. Mrs. Garrett made tea and sat across from Lena with her hands wrapped around the cup like she was trying to absorb its warmth. Tell me what happened, Lena said gently. Not what you told people afterward, but what actually happened. For a long moment, Mrs. Garrett was silent. Then, quietly, she began to speak. Thomas was a good rancher. We had 500 acres, good water, healthy cattle. We were doing fine until the drought year, 3 years with barely any rain, and the cattle started dying. We needed money for feed, for stock replacement, just to get through until the weather turned. Her voice was flat, reciting facts without feeling. Blackwood showed up one day, said he'd heard we were having troubles, said he could help. What kind of help? A loan, he said. $500 to get us through the season. But when Thomas went to sign the papers, something was wrong. The loan wasn't a loan. It was a sale agreement. Blackwood said it was just security, that if we paid back the loan, the land would stay ours. But the document said we were selling outright. Lena's pulse quickened. Did your husband sign it? He tried not to. He said he needed to read it more carefully, maybe get a lawyer to look at it. But Blackwood said the offer expired that day, that if Thomas didn't sign right then, he'd take his money elsewhere. Mrs. Garrett's hands tightened on the teacup. We were desperate. The cattle were dying. Thomas signed. And then? Then Blackwood said we had 3 months to pay back the loan plus interest, or the sale became final. Thomas worked himself half to death trying to raise the money, took on extra work, sold everything we could spare. He made payment after payment, but the amount owed never seemed to go down. Blackwood kept adding fees, processing fees, administration fees, late charges for payments that weren't even late. Let me guess, Lena said quietly. When the 3 months were up, Blackwood claimed your husband hadn't paid enough, and the land was his. Worse, Mrs. Garrett's voice cracked. Thomas went to confront him, to argue that we'd paid more than the original loan amount. That's when Blackwood's men came to the ranch. They said there'd been a complaint about stolen cattle, that Thomas needed to come to town to answer questions. He went. He didn't have a choice. And while he was gone, someone spooked the horses in our barn. Thomas came back to calm them, and she stopped, unable to finish. The horse kicked him, Lena finished softly. That's what everyone said. An accident. But Thomas had been around horses his whole life. He knew how to read them, how to stay safe. And the way the barn was set up, the way the horses were panicked. Mrs. Garrett looked at Lena with eyes that held terrible certainty. I think someone went in there deliberately to scare them. I think they knew what would happen. The room seemed to grow colder. Lena thought about Blackwood's men, about the rifle and the casual threat of violence, about the way power corrupted when it thought itself untouchable. Did you tell anyone your suspicions? Who would I tell? The sheriff's in Blackwood's pocket, the judge too. And I had no proof, just a widow's grief and paranoia. Mrs. Garrett set down her teacup with a decisive click. I took what little money I could get for the cattle and left. Came here, got work as a seamstress, tried to forget. I'm sorry, Lena said. I'm so sorry that happened to you. Sorry doesn't bring Thomas back. Sorry doesn't get me my land. Mrs. Garrett looked at Lena with sudden intensity. You really think you can fight him? You really think you can win? I think I have to try. And I think if enough people stand up and tell their stories, we have a chance. Lena leaned forward. Mrs. Garrett, would you be willing to testify about what happened? To go on record about how Blackwood manipulated your husband into signing that sale agreement? Testify where in front of a judge Blackwood controls? We're working on getting a territorial judge from outside Blackwood's influence, someone who'll actually listen. It wasn't quite true yet, but Lena was working on making it true. I can't promise we'll win, but I can promise that your husband's story will be heard and that Blackwood will have to answer for what he did. Mrs. Garrett stood and walked to the window, looking out at the Denver street with its bustle and noise and blessed anonymity. When she turned back, her face had changed, grief giving way to something harder, more determined. I'll testify. Not because I think it'll bring Thomas back or get me justice, but because maybe, just maybe, it'll stop him from doing this to someone else. She crossed to a small desk and pulled out a wooden box. And I kept something. Something I probably should have burned but couldn't bring myself to destroy. She handed Lena a letter, yellowed with age, written in careful script. Lena unfolded it and read Blackwood's own words. A letter to Thomas Garrett, dated 2 weeks before the sale, explicitly promising that the agreement was merely security for a standard loan and that full ownership would revert upon repayment of principal and reasonable interest. It was the proof they needed that Blackwood had deliberately misrepresented the terms, that he'd lied to secure the sale. This is it, Lena breathed. Mrs. Garrett, this proves fraud. This proves he knowingly deceived your husband. Then use it. Mrs. Garrett's smile was sad but fierce. Use it to burn his empire down. Lena rode back to Broken Ridge with the letter tucked safely in her bag and hope burning bright in her chest. She'd found the leverage, found the witness, found the proof that Blackwood was more than just a ruthless businessman. She'd found evidence of systematic fraud that no judge could ignore, no lawyer could explain away. She just needed to stay alive long enough to use it. The ranch came into view at sunset 3 days later, and Lena felt an unexpected surge of relief at the sight of the windmill and barn and the small house that had become something close to home. Clay was in the yard when she arrived, and the way his face transformed from worry to relief when he saw her made something warm bloom in her chest. You're back. He helped her down from the stage, and his hands lingered on her arms just a moment longer than necessary. I was starting to worry. I'm fine. Better than fine. Lena pulled out Mrs. Garrett's letter and handed it to him. Clay, we have him. We have proof of fraud, a willing witness, and a pattern of predatory behavior that goes back years. This isn't just about your ranch anymore. This is about stopping Blackwood before he destroys anyone else. Clay read the letter slowly, his expression darkening with every line. He killed Thomas Garrett. We can't prove that, but we can prove he defrauded him. And that's enough to void the land sale and establish pattern evidence for criminal prosecution. Lena felt the exhaustion of 3 days' travel catching up with her, but she pushed through it. We need to move fast now. Get this to a territorial judge before Blackwood knows we have it. And we need more witnesses. Morrison, any other ranchers you can find who've been exploited. We need to show this isn't an isolated incident. There's something you should know. Clay's voice was grim. While you were gone, Blackwood filed a complaint with the territorial court. He's claiming I defaulted on supply debts and demanding immediate seizure of my cattle as repayment. Lena's stomach dropped. Can he do that? If the judge signs the order, yes, and the judge is Gerald Hastings, Blackwood's lawyer. Clay met her eyes. We've got maybe 2 weeks before armed men show up to take everything. Maybe less. The world seemed to tilt sideways. 2 weeks. Not enough time to build the case properly. Not enough time to gather witnesses or prepare a defense. Just enough time for Blackwood to destroy them before they could expose him. Unless they moved first. Then we don't wait for him to come to us, Lena said, her mind already racing through possibilities. We take this evidence, Mrs. Garrett's testimony, and everything we've documented, and we go straight to the territorial capital. We file charges, request an investigation, and make enough noise that Blackwood can't bury this quietly. That's dangerous. If we leave the ranch unprotected, if we stay here, we lose everything anyway. Lena grabbed his hands, felt the calluses and strength there. Clay, we've been playing defense this whole time. It's time to attack. Clay looked at her for a long moment, and Lena saw the decision crystallize in his eyes. The moment where caution gave way to courage, where survival instinct transformed into fighting spirit. All right, he said, let's go to war. They didn't make it to the territorial capital. Blackwood moved faster than either of them anticipated, arriving at Broken Ridge the next morning with 10 armed men and a court order signed by Judge Gerald Hastings authorizing immediate seizure of all livestock and movable property to satisfy outstanding debts. Lena was still packing documents into her saddlebag when she heard the thunder of hooves and looked up to see the small army riding into the yard. Clay, her voice came out tight with fear. We have company. Clay emerged from the barn already moving toward his rifle, but Lena grabbed his arm hard enough to bruise. Don't. There's too many of them, and if you fire first, they'll call it resistance and justify whatever they do next. They're taking everything I own. Not if we're smarter than they are. Lena's mind raced through options, discarding and rebuilding strategies at lightning speed. Let me handle this. She walked out into the yard before Clay could stop her, her heart hammering but her spine straight. Blackwood sat his horse at the front of the group, the court order visible in his hand, and his smile was the satisfied expression of a man who'd already won. Miss Hartwell, still here, I see. Thought you might have had the sense to leave before things got unpleasant. I don't run from bullies, Mr. Blackwood. I thought you would have figured that out by now. Lena stopped 10 feet from his horse and crossed her arms. That order isn't legal. It's signed by a territorial judge. That makes it plenty legal. It's signed by your personal lawyer acting as a judge, which creates a massive conflict of interest. Any competent appeals court would throw it out in minutes. Lena had spent 3 days studying territorial law in Denver, and she wielded that knowledge now like a weapon. Furthermore, the debts you're claiming are disputed. We have documentation showing systematic overcharging and fraudulent invoicing. You can't seize property to satisfy debts that don't legally exist. Blackwood's smile didn't waver. You can dispute all you want in court, Miss Hartwell. After I've taken the cattle, after this ranch is bankrupt and Brennan has nothing left to fight with. The law's funny that way. Possession is 9/10, and I'm about to possess everything worth having here. Not everything. Lena pulled Mrs. Garrett's letter from her pocket and held it up. Recognize this? It's your own handwriting, Mr. Blackwood. A letter to Thomas Garrett promising him that the sale agreement was just security for a loan, proof that you deliberately defrauded him into signing over his land. The change in Blackwood's expression was instantaneous, shock giving way to rage so pure it was almost physical. Where did you get that? From Mrs. Garrett. Who's willing to testify about how you manipulated her husband into a predatory sale, then harassed him until the stress killed him? Lena's voice rang clear across the yard. And she's not the only one. We have Jack Morrison ready to testify about your exploitation. We have 3 other ranchers with similar stories. We have documentation of fraud going back 5 years and a pattern of systematic corruption that no judge can ignore. You're bluffing. But Blackwood's voice had lost its certainty. Am I? Want to find out? Lena took a step forward. Because here's what's going to happen, Mr. Blackwood. You're going to withdraw that seizure order and ride away from this ranch. And in exchange, I won't send copies of this letter and all our documentation to every newspaper between here and Washington, D.C. I won't file formal charges with the Territorial Attorney General. And I won't make it my personal mission to destroy everything you've built the same way you've destroyed so many other people. You wouldn't dare. Try me. Lena met his eyes and let him see the absolute conviction there. I've lost everything once already. I know what that feels like, and I survived it. Can you say the same? Because I'm betting your whole empire is built on reputation and intimidation, and both of those crumble pretty fast when people start asking the right questions. The silence stretched out like a wire pulled taut, everyone in the yard holding their breath. Lena could see Blackwood calculating, weighing his options, trying to find an angle that gave him control. But she'd taken that control away by being willing to lose everything, and men like Blackwood didn't know how to fight opponents who had nothing left to lose. Then hoofbeats shattered the standoff, dozens of them, coming fast from multiple directions. Lena turned to see riders cresting the hill to the east, more coming from the west, and her heart leaped when she recognized Jack Morrison in the lead. Behind him rode other ranchers, their families, even some townspeople from Charity Falls. 20 people, then 30, then more, all converging on Broken Ridge like they'd planned it, which, Lena realized with sudden clarity, they had. Morrison pulled up beside Lena, his weathered face set with determination. Got your message, Miss Hartwell. Figured you might need witnesses to what happens here today. My message? Lena looked at him in confusion. Clay stepped up beside her, and his hand found the small of her back, steady, warm, claiming. I sent riders out yesterday while you were sleeping, told everyone what we'd found, what we were planning, and asked them to come if they wanted to stand up to Blackwood together. And we came, another rancher called out, because we're tired of being afraid, tired of being cheated, tired of watching good people lose everything while Blackwood gets richer. Blackwood's horse shifted nervously as the crowd grew, hemming in his men. His armed riders were suddenly outnumbered 3-1, and the predatory confidence in his face began to crack. This doesn't change anything, he said, but his voice had lost its certainty. I have a legal court order from your own lawyer. Morrison's voice cut across him. We all know Gerald Hastings does whatever you tell him, but there's a federal circuit judge in Cheyenne right now, and Miss Hartwell here says she's got enough evidence to interest him in opening a formal investigation into corruption in this territory. Is that true? One of the townspeople pushed forward, the clerk from the bank, Lena realized. Because I've seen some things in the bank records that never sat right with me. Loans that disappeared from the books, transfers that didn't make sense. I always figured it wasn't my place to question it, but if someone's actually looking into Blackwood's dealings... I've got invoices that don't match what we were charged, another voice called. Receipts that were altered after I signed them. I've got a loan document that changed between when I agreed to it and when I signed, someone else added. The crowd was shifting now, fear giving way to something more powerful. The collective courage that came from not being alone anymore. Person after person spoke up, and each voice made the next one braver, until the air itself seemed to vibrate with years of suppressed anger finally finding release. Blackwood's face had gone white. You're all making a terrible mistake. I own this territory. The businesses, the bank, the judge. You think one federal circuit judge is going to overturn the whole system? Maybe not, Lena said quietly. But newspapers love a good corruption story. And I worked in a print shop for 16 years, mister. Blackwood. I know exactly how to write a headline that sells papers, and exactly which journalists are hungry enough for a big story that they'll investigate instead of just printing press releases. She pulled another document from her bag, not Mrs. Garrett's letter this time, but a telegram she'd sent from Denver before leaving. I've already contacted the Rocky Mountain News and the Cheyenne Daily Leader, told them I have documented evidence of widespread land fraud and judicial corruption in Wyoming territory. Both editors wrote back asking for an interview. Blackwood stared at the telegram like it was a snake. You wouldn't. I already did. The only question is whether I give them the full story or tell them the investigation is closed because you've agreed to make restitution to everyone you've defrauded. Lena folded the telegram carefully and tucked it away. Your choice, Mr. Blackwood, but choose fast because my patience is running thin and these witnesses are all watching to see what you do next. For a long moment, Blackwood sat frozen on his horse, the absolute shock of losing visible on his face. He'd built an empire on the assumption that people were too scared or too isolated to fight back, and Lena had just proved that assumption catastrophically wrong. This isn't over, he finally said, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. Actually, it is. Clay stepped forward, and his hand rested on his revolver with casual confidence. You're going to ride back to town and withdraw that seizure order. You're going to write off the fraudulent debts you've been charging me and everyone else here. And you're going to sell back the Garrett property to Mrs. Garrett at the price you paid for it, because that sale was fraudulent and we can prove it. And if I refuse, then we take all this evidence to the federal judge, file criminal charges, and let the court sort it out. Lena's voice was steel wrapped in silk. But either way, your days of running this territory, like your personal kingdom, are over. The only question is whether you lose everything in a public scandal or whether you cut your losses and walk away with something left. Blackwood looked around at the crowd, at the ranchers and townspeople who'd found their courage, at the documentation in Lena's hands that could destroy him. She could see him running calculations, looking for angles, trying to find a way to win, but there wasn't one. Not anymore. Fine. The word came out like broken glass. I'll withdraw the order, but this ranch still owes me for legitimate supplies and services. We'll pay fair market rate for actual goods received, Clay interrupted. Nothing more. And we'll be checking every invoice against independent verification from here on out. Blackwood's jaw worked like he was chewing gravel. Finally, he jerked his horse's reins and turned away. This isn't finished, Brennan. You've made an enemy today. No, Clay said quietly. I've made a choice, and I'd make it again. Blackwood rode away with his men trailing behind him like the remnants of a broken army, and the crowd erupted in cheers and relieved laughter. People rushed forward to shake Clay's hand, to thank Lena, to share their own stories of exploitation and relief at finally being able to speak freely. Morrison clapped Clay on the shoulder hard enough to stagger him. You did it, son. You actually stood up to him. We did it, Clay corrected, looking at Lena with something in his eyes that made her breath catch. None of this happens without Lena. She found the evidence, tracked down the witnesses, built the case. She's the reason we're still standing. Then we owe you our thanks, Miss Hartwell. Morrison turned to the crowd. 3 cheers for Miss Hartwell, who taught us that documentation beats intimidation every time. The cheers washed over Lena in a wave that left her dizzy. She'd spent weeks feeling worthless, being told she had nothing to offer, believing that her skills didn't matter in the real world. And now she stood in a ranch yard in Wyoming territory, surrounded by people celebrating her competence, her courage, her refusal to accept that might made right. The celebration continued for hours, people sharing food, telling stories, making plans to help each other rebuild now that Blackwood's stranglehold was broken. Someone produced a fiddle, and music filled the evening air. Children chased each other around the yard while their parents talked about cooperative purchasing agreements and shared equipment and all the ways they could support each other now that they weren't being deliberately isolated. As sunset painted the sky in shades of copper and gold, Lena found herself standing apart from the crowd, watching the community she'd helped create without quite meaning to. She'd come to Wyoming territory expecting nothing but a temporary escape from a life she couldn't control. Instead, she'd found purpose, partnership, and the kind of belonging that came from being valued for who she actually was, rather than who people wanted her to be. You should be celebrating. Clay's voice came from behind her, warm and familiar. I am celebrating, just quietly. Lena turned to face him, and something in his expression made her pulse quicken. We really did it, didn't we? Stopped Blackwood, saved the ranch, built something that matters. You did it. I just provided the crisis that needed solving. Clay moved closer, and Lena could smell leather and sage and the particular scent of honest work. Lena, I need to tell you something. Well, if this is about the contract, I'm planning to renew it. 6 more months minimum, assuming you still want. I don't want you to renew the contract. Clay's words hit her like cold water, and Lena felt her stomach drop. At least not the way it's currently written. Oh. Lena tried to keep the hurt out of her voice and failed. I understand. Now that the Blackwood situation is resolved, you probably don't need... Lena, stop. Clay caught her hands, held them gently. I don't want you to renew it because I want to offer you something different, something better. I don't understand. The contract we wrote was about business, wages for work, separate quarters, no obligations beyond professional services. And it made sense when you were a stranger who needed protection and I was a rancher who needed help. Clay's thumbs traced circles on the backs of her hands. But you're not a stranger anymore. You're the reason I wake up excited to face the day instead of dreading it. You're the person I want to share victories with and strategize problems with and build a future with. Lena's breath caught. Clay, I'm not asking you to be my employee anymore, Lena. I'm asking you to be my partner. Real partnership, equal say in the ranch, equal share in the profits, equal voice in every decision. He paused, and vulnerability flickered across his face. And if you felt the same way I do, maybe more than just business partnership. Maybe the kind where we build something together that's bigger than either of us could build alone. You're asking me to marry you. Lena said it as a statement, not a question. I'm asking if you'd consider it, not because it's proper or expected or because I need someone to cook and clean, but because I've spent the last month watching you fight for what's right and stand up to bullies and refuse to be diminished by people who think competence has a gender. Clay's smile was crooked, honest, and somewhere along the way, I fell in love with you. Not in spite of your stubbornness and your sharp mind and your refusal to back down because of those things, because you're exactly who you are and you don't apologize for it. Lena felt tears prickling behind her eyes, but they were good tears this time. The kind that came from being seen clearly and loved anyway. I came to Wyoming Territory expecting nothing but temporary employment and a chance to avoid a loveless marriage. I didn't expect to find purpose or partnership or, her voice cracked, or someone who valued me for my competence instead of in spite of it. Is that a yes? It's a let me finish. Lena squeezed his hands. My uncle wanted to marry me off to solve a problem. Horace Pemberton wanted a housekeeper who came with political connections. Every man I met back east saw me as something to be managed or improved or corrected. And you, she had to stop and breathe through the emotion. You saw me as someone worth listening to, worth trusting, worth standing beside as an equal. Because you are an equal. You're smarter than me about a lot of things, Lena. I'd be a fool not to recognize that. And you're smarter than me about running cattle and reading weather and surviving in country that still scares me sometimes. Lena stepped closer until she could feel the warmth of him. But together, we're better than either of us alone. You taught me that. And yes, Clay Brennan, I will absolutely consider marrying you on one condition. Name it. That we write it all down. Marriage contract, partnership agreement, everything spelled out clearly so there's never any question about what we agreed to and why. Lena's smile was tremulous but genuine. I trust you, but I also trust documentation. Clay laughed, a real laugh, surprised and delighted. You want a marriage contract? I want clarity. I want both of us to go into this knowing exactly what we're committing to, what we expect from each other, what happens if circumstances change. Lena touched his face gently. The world tried to write my story without asking me. I want us to write this chapter together, in words we both agree to. Then we'll write it together. Clay pulled her close, and Lena let herself lean into the embrace. Every clause, every provision, every expectation, all of it documented and signed and witnessed just like you like it. Perfect. Lena tilted her face up, and Clay kissed her, gentle at first, then deeper, a promise sealed with touch instead of words. Around them, the celebration continued, but for this moment they existed in their own space, building something new from honesty and respect and the kind of love that came from choosing each other when the world offered easier alternatives. When they finally pulled apart, Lena saw Morrison watching from across the yard with a knowing smile. She felt her face heat, but Morrison just raised his cup in salute and turned back to his conversation. Everyone's going to know by morning, Clay said. Good. Let them talk. Lena laced her fingers through his. I'm done caring what people think about my choices. Even when they think you're crazy for marrying a cowboy who can barely read his own contracts? Especially then. Lena pulled him toward the house, toward the lamplight, and the table still covered with documents that had saved them both. Besides, you've got me to read them for you now, and I've got you to remind me that competence without courage is just wasted potential. We balance each other. They spent the evening writing their agreement, not a traditional marriage contract, but a true partnership document that spelled out shared ownership of the ranch, equal decision-making authority, and provisions for how they'd handle disagreements and major decisions. Lena wrote it in her clear hand while Clay dictated his expectations, and together they built something that felt less like a cage and more like a foundation. "We should add something about learning," Clay said, as Lena finished a paragraph about financial management. "I want to learn to read better, properly, and I want you to teach me how you analyze contracts and find the hidden clauses. And I want to learn ranching, really learn it, how to work cattle, mend fence, all of it," Lena added the clause. "If we're partners, I should understand all aspects of the business. Even the parts that involve getting kicked by ornery steers and frozen fingers in January? Especially those parts." Lena met his eyes over the document. "I spent 16 years working beside my father in the print shop. I know what real partnership looks like, Clay. It's not about division of labor, it's about both people understanding the whole enterprise and respecting each other's contributions." Clay read through what they'd written, his finger following each line with careful attention. When he looked up, his expression was soft with something that might have been wonder. "My father would have loved you. He always said the best marriages were the ones where both people made each other smarter and braver." "Your mother, too," Lena said. "From everything you've told me, she was the kind of woman who'd understand wanting everything documented. She kept 3 copies of every important paper and stored them in different locations." Clay's smile was fond with memory. "Used to drive my father crazy until the year the barn burned and he realized we still had all our land deeds and stock certificates safe in the house." They signed the agreement as the clock struck midnight, and Lena felt something settle into place in her chest, a sense of rightness that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with mutual respect and shared purpose. This wasn't the fairy tale ending where the princess got rescued by the prince. This was 2 capable people choosing to build something together, documenting their choices, and trusting each other to honor their commitments. The next morning, they rode into Charity Falls together to have the agreement witnessed and filed with the territorial registry. The town was buzzing with news of Blackwood's humiliation, and people stopped them on the street to shake their hands and share their own stories of exploitation finally ended. The bank clerk who'd helped them before pulled Lena aside with nervous energy. "Miss Hartwell, there's something you should know. After Blackwood left yesterday, I started going through the bank records more carefully, found evidence of loan manipulation going back 7 years, amounts changed after signing, interest rates that don't match the contracts, forced foreclosures based on fraudulent default claims." Lena's pulse quickened. "Have you documented it?" "Every instance, copied the records, noted the discrepancies, built a timeline." The clerk handed her a thick envelope. "I figured if anyone would know what to do with this, it's you." "Why are you giving this to me?" The clerk's smile was bitter. "Because I've been watching Blackwood destroy good people for years and telling myself it wasn't my business to interfere. But you showed me that silence is the same as complicity, and I'm done being complicit." Lena took the envelope feeling the weight of it, not just the physical weight of paper, but the weight of responsibility and possibility. This could bring formal criminal charges against Blackwood, federal prosecution, maybe prison time. Good. He's earned it. The clerk straightened his shoulders. "I'll testify if needed. So will others at the bank. We're ready to stand up now that someone's shown us it's possible." By the time Lena and Clay left town, they had commitments from 6 more witnesses and documentation of fraud spanning nearly a decade. The federal circuit judge was due in Cheyenne in 2 weeks, and Lena sent a telegram requesting a meeting to present evidence of systematic corruption in the Wyoming territorial judiciary. "This is bigger than saving the ranch now," Clay said as they rode home through afternoon sunshine. "This is about changing how justice works in the whole territory." "I know." Lena felt the enormity of it settling on her shoulders. "Clay, if we do this, if we really push for formal prosecution and judicial reform, Blackwood's going to fight back with everything he has. It could get dangerous." "It's already dangerous. We've just decided to stop pretending otherwise." Clay looked at her with steady certainty. "But we're doing it together now, and we're doing it with witnesses and documentation and the law on our side. That's more than most people who've tried to stand up to corruption ever had." The federal investigation took 3 months to complete, and during that time Broken Ridge became an unlikely hub of resistance against corruption. Ranchers brought their records to Lena for analysis, townspeople shared stories of exploitation, and slowly, carefully, a case was built that even Blackwood's lawyers couldn't explain away. Judge Gerald Hastings was removed from the bench and disbarred for accepting bribes and manipulating legal proceedings. The Territorial Bank and Trust was placed under federal oversight and forced to return all properties seized through fraudulent foreclosures. Blackwood himself was indicted on 14 counts of fraud, conspiracy, and corruption, though he fled to California before the trial and never returned to Wyoming. But the real victory wasn't in Blackwood's downfall. It was in what grew from the ashes of his empire. The ranchers formed a cooperative that negotiated directly with buyers and suppliers, cutting out predatory middlemen. The town established an elected judicial review board to prevent future corruption, and Lena found herself in unexpected demand as a consultant for other territories dealing with similar exploitation. 6 months after the confrontation in the ranch yard, Lena and Clay were married in a simple ceremony at Broken Ridge, with every rancher and townsperson who'd stood with them in attendance. Morrison gave Lena away. Mrs. Garrett, who'd returned from Denver to reclaim her land, stood as witness, and the circuit preacher who performed the ceremony remarked that he'd never seen a couple exchange vows while simultaneously signing a legal partnership agreement. "It's very thorough," he said, reading through the document with professional interest. "I've never seen a marriage contract that includes provisions for profit sharing and dispute resolution." "We like clarity," Lena said, and Clay squeezed her hand in agreement. As the sun set on their wedding day, Lena stood in the yard of Broken Ridge Ranch, her ranch now, legally and officially, and thought about the stagecoach ride that had brought her here. She'd stepped off that coach expecting temporary employment and a chance to avoid a loveless marriage. Instead, she'd found purpose, partnership, and a love that came from being valued for her competence rather than in spite of it. Clay came up behind her and wrapped his arms around her waist. "What are you thinking about?" "About how I almost didn't get off that stagecoach. About how close I came to choosing the safe option instead of the right one." Lena leaned back against him. "And about how grateful I am that you were stubborn enough to block the road with your cattle." "Best decision I ever made." Clay's voice was warm against her ear. "Well, second best. First best was hiring you. Third best was agreeing to marry me. That was the same as hiring you, just with better benefits." Clay turned her to face him, and his smile was the one she'd come to love, honest, open, with no pretense or performance. "Lena Brennan, business partner and wife, I have a proposition for you." "I'm listening." "I've been thinking about expansion, not just the ranch, but the consulting work you've been doing. What if we formalized it? Set up an actual business helping people document exploitation and build cases against corrupt operators. You'd run the business side, I'd provide security and support, and we'd use what we learned here to help people everywhere fight back against the Blackwoods of the world." Lena felt excitement kindle in her chest. "You want to turn fraud investigation into a business?" "I want to turn your skills into something that helps more people, and I want to build something together that's bigger than either of us alone." Clay's expression turned serious. "But only if you want to. This is your choice, Lena. Always your choice." Lena thought about Mrs. Garrett, about Morrison's children, about all the people who'd found their courage because someone had finally shown them that documentation beat intimidation and knowledge was power even when you didn't have authority. She thought about her father teaching her to set type and keep books, about 16 years of learning skills the world said didn't matter because she was female. And she thought about standing in this ranch yard months ago with nothing but a canvas bag and a desperate hope that maybe, just maybe, she could find a place where her competence mattered more than her gender. "Yes," she said simply. "Let's do it. Let's build something that matters." They sealed the agreement with a kiss, and around them the Wyoming night settled in with its vast sky and endless stars. Somewhere out in the darkness, other people were fighting their own battles against corruption and exploitation. Other families were struggling under the weight of predatory contracts and systematic fraud, but now they had something they hadn't had before. Proof that fighting back was possible, that documentation could defeat intimidation, and that sometimes the most radical thing you could do was stand up and say, "No more," in a voice loud enough that others found the courage to join you. Lena and Clay walked back to their house hand in hand, ready to write the next chapter of their story together, in clear language, with witnesses, and with all the fierce determination of two people who'd chosen each other when the world had tried to choose for them. And in the morning, they'd start building their business. They'd help the next person who needed documentation to fight back. They'd prove again that knowledge without courage was wasted potential, but knowledge with courage could change the world. One contract, one case, one victory at a time. The ledger and the lasso. Competence and courage, documentation and determination, working together to build something better than what came before. It wasn't the ending Lena had expected when she stepped off that stagecoach into the Wyoming dust. It was better. Because she'd earned it, chosen it, and built it with her own hands alongside someone who valued every skill she brought to the partnership. And that made all the difference.